Busy meeting today. I'm expecting Bob Shercliffe and John Thompson, and I can't see the Greg Smith. I'm expecting both of them. So we'll get started. Since part of what we'll do, we're going to be picking up from where we left off on Wednesday. Why don't we go around and introduce ourselves for purposes of the public records? Kelly, why don't you start since they're talking?
Okay. Kelly O'Leary.
Bill Rupp.
Charlie Appleby.
Kirsten Doolittle.
Carl Cannon.
Bill Shy.
David Bohr.
Bob Miller.
Greg Anderson.
Sherry McGill.
Thank you. Let's come to order back in the back, please. Thank you. So we can hear each other. And I'll remind y'all to talk into the microphone so everybody can hear. Over the weekend, we had one event that was exciting, and that was that John Thompson's wife had a baby. And I don't know whether it was their first or not. I sort of think it was their third. Okay, well, they know what they're doing then. So hopefully John will be here. She's know what he's doing. He's still saying yes, dear. My wife hasn't arrived yet. Please note that. Last week, we ended up with adopting, after a lot of discussion, the design of the plan going forward for both new and current employees. We had a lot of discussion. The sheriff and the fire chief also addressed us, and we left, though, with a couple of items that we wanted to consider today. And David Bohr had asked Robert DeZubi to do some analysis of that on the what would happen if we changed the final average salary period for existing employees from 2 years to 5, like we have done with the new employees. And number two, what would happen if we raised the minimum age for the beginning of the COLA to age 55? So anybody want to discuss those any further? I might say also that there have been news reports and other things over the Friday and the weekend, and I just want to remind us that the politics of all of this is very pressure-packed, and we need to stay above that, and we really need to try to do what we see as the right thing. And so it's not anybody's plan that we come up with. It's not our plan, it's not the mayor's plan, it's not the fund's plan, it's not the city council's plan. It's the community's plan, and we are doing what we're doing because of the community. So I hope all of us will remember that when we have a chance to speak to the press, those who do, and I'm not going to name, but everybody knows who they are, that we remember that we're all in this together, and this is for the community. It's not for anybody's particular ego. I'll put it that way. So we really need to keep that before us. So y'all have been great about that so far, and we just need to keep on keeping on. So let's talk about whether we want to also include for existing employees in our recommendations that we change the final average salary to what we've done for the new employees, and that would be to change that from, and this would be only going forward, remember, we can't do it going backwards, that it would be the 5-year average salary rather than 2 years. David, you want to speak to that?
We had, for the broader purpose of trying to get the ongoing cost of pension benefits for existing employees closer to the number that we've targeted for new, we had identified those requests. The good point was made, I think by Kristen, I think you made the point, hey, it'd be nice to know sort of exactly what the impact this is, what's it worth. In working with Robert, the city was actually constrained in being able to give an answer to that question.
Okay.
But it may be, if we were to call an audible, that, Robert, you might feel comfortable talking about a range, and maybe we give you a little bit of time to talk about it. But I think for purposes of the inquiry on the table, we know it's going to reduce the cost. Is it bigger than a bread box is sort of the question. And if you
Okay.
could, when you're comfortable, think a little bit about the sizing of some of those changes.
Yep.
That might be a helpful guidance.
And Robert, thank you. Why don't you talk about both of those, the 55 on the COLA and the 5 years?
Okay, right. Robert DeZubi from Milliman. There were two issues. One was for current employees, future benefits would be based on 5-year average pay or 60 months rather than 2 years or 24 months. We talked with Jim Lynn about how to interpret that, just to make sure we didn't violate any accrued benefit laws or Florida laws. And what Jim Lynn told us to do is calculate a 5-year average pay, but never allow it to get less than the current 2-year average pay, which really means for the next year or two, the 2-year frozen pay would still be greater, but once you go out a couple of years, the 5-year pay would start controlling. We started running it. As he said, we ran out of time and constraints. It saves money, but it's not a huge amount of money, let's put it that way. It's all a relative term. We started to look at the deferring the cost of livings on the future benefits, future cost of living, wait, I gotta say that right. Deferring the cost of living for future benefit increases for the current employees. We were asked to look at it at ages 55, 60, or 62. Obviously, the more you defer it, the more money you save. I believe it will be a decent amount of money, but again, time constraints just did not allow us to do it.
Right.
I had said when we had our discussion on Wednesday, from our computer system point of view, that's a complicated piece of programming, and they had started to look at it, but they just ran out of time. 1 or 2 days just is not enough.
So that if we included that as a possibility, as for something to be considered going forward, but not taking a position on it, but just saying that this is something else to be considered, would that be appropriate? Because we don't have all the facts. But because we're going to the council and that would go to collective bargaining, I suppose. But, Bill?
Mr. Chairman, I've seen another organization deal with this. Perhaps it's similar to that. Because people who are very close to retirement could be adversely impacted, they've said, we'll start this 5 years from now. So anybody who's within 2 or 3 years of retiring keeps that same level, and you've got time to plan if it's going to be later. We won't make this final call. The city will have to do that, but it's one option for them to consider.
Okay. Kirsten?
I think if we're going to step back and let Mr. Dizzy have some more time, I think one thing we want to look at is, in order just to be consistent, is what kind of incentive are these proposals going to have on the workforce? It seems like any sort of deferral on the cost of living might have an incentive of having people continue to work until they're closer to the age for the deferment, which I don't know is a good incentive based on what we heard from the different fire and the police chiefs. I mean, they seem to think that the average lifespan of these men and women doing their jobs is 25, 30 years. So if we're having people stay on until they're 60 to wait until they retire, it seems like that might not be the best incentive to encourage.
Yep. That's a good point. I think we ended up with somewhere between 55 and 60 as far as that 25-year period. So, let me just recognize the mayor is here and the council president is here, and we're glad that y'all are here. So, thank you. Other comments?
Could you frame it a little bit in terms of, do we know it may be worth at least 1% of normal cost, but not more than 3%?
Well, I believe that the calculations in the experience study by the plan actuary, so this is for the 5 years ending 2011, and this also responds to that other point, shows that the average police or firefighter is either retiring or primarily going into drop after 23 years of service. I'm doing this from memory now, so if the average higher age is somewhere between 23 and 26, means they're going to drop
47.
47, 48. And so delaying the COLA to 55 could be an 8-year delay. Delaying it to 62 would be a 13 delay.
Yeah.
So that would be a fairly significant
Significant.
reduction.
Right.
I believe I'm doing this from memory, so I didn't bring my notes out with me. I think we showed that going from the 3% of COLA to the 1.5% of COLA would reduce costs by about 8%, normal cost about 8%. It should be on that chart.
Right.
And I don't know if that's net of the 3% or gross of the 3%, so if it's either 5 or 8. So this would be, it could be another 1 to 3% depending which age you pick.
So if it's in the 1 to 3% range, and it adopts a philosophy that says, ideally, it'd be nice if we could get our costs under a little bit better control,
Mhm.
right? And given the example we've set for new employees,
Right.
and if it's in the range of 1 to 3, that seems to be, as a
Appropriate.
judgment, in my view, an appropriate,
And it puts it at the age that you want them
right?
to be.
And then whether it's 55 or 60 maybe is a good debate, but,
Yeah. Well, would someone like to make a motion to do it one way or the other so that we can debate it? Mr. Boer?
I think in looking at the other cities too, there's a good example for 60 is a point where other cities have, am I right in saying that, in our chart of other cities' activities? So I
David, would you
prefer-
know the answer to that? Dave Drain?
If we look at the comparison tables that we put together for one of the prior presentations. You know, I don't have that on hand. Let me look into it and let me see if I can get an answer shortly.
Okay,
Yeah.
right.
Oh, we have, David, we have.
Oh, good, okay.
Of the ones where we see a waiting period, it seems to be about 55 is what they're targeting. So where we do see a waiting period, and many of them don't have any waiting period, but where we do, it seems to be targeting age 55.
Okay, thank you. So we need to have something to move us forward. If someone would like to make a motion, I'll be glad to entertain it.
This was on, are we talking now about the deferral or the average?
Let's do the deferral to age 55. That's what he's been talking about. So would anybody like to move that, or some other age?
I'd like to move that we defer the COLA to age 60.
To age 60. Is there a second?
I'll second for discussion.
Okay. So this is for existing employees. Right. Yes, and Greg is not discussing this. Right. Any discussion on this, Kirsten?
Yeah, I think I just go back to my initial point, which is that I think this encourages police officers to stay beyond their 25 years. I don't know also that we've seen some hard and fast information on how this would reduce the normal cost. And I think it encourages a very bad incentive. I think also you have to look at the cost to the city of, you know, once we incent these people to work beyond 25 years, they're going to have injuries. And so what is the cost of managing those workers' comp claims and the difficulty of having more senior police officers on the street?
Okay. Are you speaking against the motion as a whole, or just the
Yes,
60
I'm
as a
speaking
whole?
against the motion as a whole.
Okay. Other comments? Charlie?
I apologize, I wasn't here at the last meeting. Have we, in terms of the structure of the plan itself, this is discussing when the COLAs would come into effect. Do we have a recommendation that was approved or not about the amount of the COLA?
Yes, and that, as you'll recall, for new employees, it was to reduce it to CPI or 1.5%, whichever is lower. And we voted last week to extend that to current employees also.
So this would be then a combination of, the change would be not only delaying the COLA's impact until to age 60 in the motion on the floor, but we've also previously recommended to apply to all employees that the current COLA, I think it's 3%.
Correct.
It's the lesser of CPI or 1.5%.
Correct.
Make sure I understand.
That's right.
For prospective benefit.
Prospective, yeah, you can't go backwards.
I
So it's
mean,
only
I'm sure, I
prospective.
understand it's
Right,
prospective, right.
And right. Other discussion?
Well, quick question, it goes to Kirsten's point, and since we're made this previous recommendation, what's the typical experience? Do most folks retire before 60, and how many years are they retired? So, I mean, is it 5 years? Is it 10 years before COLA kicks in? I'm trying to get a better read on what this really means for the
What I
retiree.
heard David and Robert say that the retirement was about age 47.
We,
So you wouldn't get a COLA for 13 years
Under
under
this-
this proposal?
Yes.
you would get, if I'm understanding correctly, you would get COLA on the benefits you have earned to date. It's just the future COLA that you would be earning, I think. is
Right.
proposed.
This is for existing employees, so that means the old rule would apply on the existing benefits. But going forward, the new proposal would be reduced, plus the date would start. But you couldn't change what had already been granted. So if you retired at 48 and you had the 3%, you'd get it starting right away. Is that- Okay, Charlie?
Generally, I would be in support of the motion, but the concern I have that was mentioned earlier is those participants who are at or near retirement. My concern is the transition for those people. If somebody's within a couple of years of retirement, whatever that means exactly, I'm not sure. But to me, there should be some transition period to allow the participants in the plan to reasonably plan for that change, as opposed to somebody who is going to retire next month, all of a sudden this is significantly changed. That one bothers me a bit. I'm in agreement with the ultimate policy, but I'm concerned about the timing at which we are recommending this to be imposed.
So do you have a suggestion?
I was hoping somebody smarter than me would come up with that.
Well, you could do it the same way,
Bill?
and influence it, have it begin 5 years from now, or
So beginning 5 years from now, as you suggested.
that
So
deals with that issue.
5 years past the implementation, in other words.
Let me just ask
Yep.
Bill, if somebody's a year away, then they've earned 98% of their benefit or whatever, so the COLA, they already have the COLA on that part.
Right.
So I guess the question is, where do you sort of cut off? Where have they not earned most of their benefits, and how much change are we actually making to what they earn?
Kirsten?
I think we need to see more numbers in terms of, or at least more visibility on, I think this has a pretty significant change to the workforce and the incentives that it's going to drive. I think we need to see what the real benefit is to a reduction of the normal cost before we should even vote on this kind of motion. I think we're voting on a motion that has pretty impactful change without a firm understanding of the benefit.
Okay. So I'm seeing some nodding of the heads. So would you like to move to postpone it to our, what will be another meeting? All right, so would you like to make that motion?
So moved, yes.
Okay, is there a second? Any-
We have a motion and a second on the floor.
Yeah, no, you moved to postpone the motion, and that's perfectly legitimate.
So it'll still
Right.
be a-
And that, to a date certain, that takes priority. Okay, so this is now a motion to postpone this to our next meeting.
Discussion.
Yes,
And so on.
if it's discussable.
On that point, our gap is, between now and the next meeting, or maybe we don't have an agreed plan for how we're gonna get that data. So we need the city to, I think, consider with Mr. DeZubi whether it's feasible that we can get a defined range or some other thing.
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, issue has gone so far abroad of the mediated settlement that it's not an appropriate expenditure to use with my litigation expert, even if I have the funds, which I don't, with Max. So that's the issue, is that this was a subject matter not addressed because we could make no progress on it. And now, as we're going to go in charge, we'd have to go within the city and engage him to run another, million of these things. So I think if that's where the committee is, and that's where we'll bring it back, but that's a hold-off, is that our budget has
Sure.
been exhausted to have Mr. Tsuzubi run.
So one alternative is to say that this is something that should be considered as it goes to the council, rather than delay our work. So not adopt it, but just to say they need to get the additional facts, and I'm just raising that as a way to get it handled. So Cindy has the pragmatic approach. David?
And when we have this uncertainty, it seems to me if Robert, without putting him in a position where he can't speak to numbers he doesn't have, but if there's a range, and to the extent of uncertainty, we make the range a little bit wider. But I mean, we're dealing with a cost today that at the 5.4% is about 31%, not paid, for the city and for chapter funds, if those were to cover it. And so that's significantly above the new employee, which is about 19. So 3 to 4% kind of a cutting of costs
Would bring them
would
closer,
actually,
yeah.
is what the objective is. And so I don't think I think we do need to know what the number is. I think we could live with the range. I think having a range and some further definition would be much more productive for city council than just throw it out there as another idea.
Okay.
So,
So that would militate to taking this up again at our next meeting with the information.
and I think the takeaway would be, can we, without a lot of work, define an upper range as to what it would be? I think we probably have to be clear as to, well, if it wouldn't start for 5 years. So I think those are, we could do that. It doesn't start for 5 years.
Robert?
Delay until,
I bought something along the way there.
Between now and next week, could you give us a range of what the savings might be, the effect on the cost to the city?
based on work you've already done.
She's looking at Cindy.
Hmm?
Yeah, so
There's one way to approach it that's cost-effective, and another way in which we have to transfer money. And I think what Mr. Bohr was stating was, we know approximately the value of 1 year of COLA for today's present payroll. So you know what that is, how much it costs you a year. You can get some sense of where it is comparative to something else by saying if you take a fraction of the workforce, half, 3/4, whatever number, whatever retirement age you want to put, how much is it worth? When I deal myself in trying to resolve matters with so many financial hypotheticals, I just want to know what the relative value is of this weight, because precise math on this point is pretty meaningless, because we don't know when people will retire and what they'll do. So if we know, for example, what 1 year of COLA costs us presently, would that be adequate? Because I believe we have that information to come back and have you discuss.
1 year COLA
if you
cost
then
at
delayed it 5
and those
years.
would all be, well, you still have to compute the 1.5% also, which would be different. Then you'd have to break
3%.
out that would go 5 years out for going forward.
I mean, it's a rough number, but it
Yeah.
seems to me that it's an approximation of what you're saving,
Yeah.
and probably no less inaccurate than any of the other hypotheticals we're adopting.
I guess to estimate removing 1.5% of COLA for, say, 5 years is not a hard
Okay.
thing for us to do.
Okay.
To actually do it precisely, say 55 or 60 or 62, is much harder because everybody has a different amount of years. But we can do it for 5 years.
Kirsten?
I think if we're going to ask him to do that, which I think is appropriate and fair, I think it's equally fair to bring back Chief Centerfit and
The sheriff?
Sheriff Rutherford to talk about the impact on or whether they think this would incent employees to stay beyond an appropriate time, and just ask them their take on that specific question.
Okay. Is your hand up, John?
Yeah, I feel like we've got the challenge of all the plan design changes not knowing what their impact is. And as we talked about last time, we want to make sure that the plan supports the policies we want to have relative to retirement. And so It seems like, to Kirsten's point about this particular thing, we don't want to be inconsistent with what the desired retirement age would be. And also, we need to understand, of all the plan design changes in general, what is that going to move us towards relative to the target that we have this associated with plan design changes? Because once we get past that, then we're dealing with the other funding mechanisms or sources. So I think it's important that we get there. I'm just not sure how we do that.
Neither is the chair. We do need the information. I don't think it's something we can get this afternoon before we leave. So it seems to me that we would, we've done the work on the rest of the design. It's just these two things. That would that be sufficient for our purposes to have Robert come up with a number of what it would be to take out 1.5% for a year and see where that leaves us? Does that get us where we want to go?
Well, do we know the impact of the design changes already made up to this point? In other words, if
I
you have
think
that,
David
and then
is
what you're
go-
doing was adding a range to that relative to the COLA, and at
Right.
least we'd have a sense of, okay, we've had this kind of impact with plan design.
Right. I think we have got that. David has come up with some slides today that he's going to go through. So y'all need to help me. Is that going to be the sufficient information for you? And I will say on both the average, changing the average compensation years and this, to have that taken up at our next meeting.
And so, knowing the value of deferring is a dollar number, and I think what we're interested in is sort of a normal cost equivalent, right? I bet you could,
What I'm saying, I think we can do something fairly simple.
okay.
I think we can expand that normal cost chart to include both the final 5 and, say, deferring the COLA for a fixed number of years.
Okay.
At least it'll be at the 7%, and then you can ratio down to the 5.4.
Right. And then we can make the decision as to whether we want to exclude it or postpone it for 5 years or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. Are y'all happy with that? Let's vote on that. So if you're in favor of that, that would be, you would vote in favor of the motion to postpone. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, thank you. All right, thank you, David. We move now to the unfunded liability discussion and the amount to fund annually. David Drain has taken what we did last year, and he has prepared a presentation for us to begin that discussion.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here once again. Great to be here in a place that's above freezing. And, you know, this task force has done a tremendous amount of work thinking about issues of governance and plan design, both going forward and for current employees. But ultimately, any solution that doesn't sustainably address the existing pension debt is going to, you know, be insufficient, is going to, you know, put the benefits promised to retirees and employees in jeopardy, and is going to threaten taxpayers in the future. You know, any solution, regardless of how brilliant the plan design is, that isn't going to pay down the pension debt isn't going to work. And so we wanted to help share with you, and some of the stuff you've seen before, several different potential paths towards doing that. You know, the question we're going to try to help you answer is, you know, how much needs to go in? You know, I don't think we are equipped to give, you know, great insights, you know, as, you know, people not based in Jacksonville and key stakeholders about where precisely the money is going to come from. So obviously we would, you know, a thoughtful debate among the task force could really give a lot of value to the different parties thinking about it. But we wanted to help the task force come up with a number of what should that target be. And so we modeled 6 different funding scenarios. First is simply a baseline. What is current policies? What are current plan design? What are current funding approaches? These are numbers you've seen before. All the other proposals incorporate the recommendations that have already been voted on by the task force. So the provisions on new benefits and on increasing current employee contributions and cost of living adjustments for new workers and current workers not incorporating any of the delays, have been built into these. And then within that, we wanted to look at 5 different scenarios. One is what happens if simply Jacksonville makes the actuarially required contributions going forward. This is the bare minimum of best practices. It's also required by Florida law. So at the very least, Jacksonville is going to have to do this. And this is simply paying for new benefits as they're incurred, and also having a 30-year payment period for Jacksonville's pension debt, just like you'd pay off a mortgage. And then 4 other proposals that go above and beyond that. One is the mayor's proposal using JEA funds and chapter funds to supplement the ARC, and so the police and fire pension funds at least 80% funded. Secondly, and not specifying where these dollars come from, what happens if you simply put in $45 million a year exactly until the plan is 90% funded? And that's around either a 1 mil property tax increase, or I believe the estimates that were talked about were a half-cent sales tax increase. And then, what happens if instead of just 45 million, if it was 90 million or 135 million? As we've done before, we looked at 2 investment scenarios. What happens if returns hit the plan's assumptions of 7%? What are costs going to be? What are funding levels going to be? And then secondly, what happens if you fall short? What if plan returns are just 5.4%? So these are annual employer pension costs under 7% returns. The yellow line is that baseline scenario under the old methods, including the old actuarial or the old amortization methods that created a big spike. And then the blue line with black triangle or black diamonds is if simply the city pays the ARC. You see that that's fairly level across the whole 30-year period, and then drops down when the pension debt is paid for. The green line is the city proposal, and then the 3 dashed lines, purple, teal, and light blue, are the different fixed funding levels or fixed contributions until the plan is 90% funded. It's a little easier to see, and it takes away that baseline scenario, which clearly is not going to be the path that the task force is going to recommend, and instead looks at the different funding scenarios. Once again, ARC fairly stable across the whole funding period. All the other methods put more in front, and they're going to cost the city more in the short term, but are going to lead to hitting your funding targets faster and reducing costs in the long run. This is just like if you pay a credit card debt, you spend 30 years paying down your credit card debt, interest is going to add up, it's going to cost more. If you do it in 20 years or 15 years, you're going to end up paying a lot less in total.
So David, would you just, for those of us who aren't used to looking at these, would you just explain each of those lines for us and what it's saying at the years in terms of dollars? I mean, for example, on the ARC one.
Yeah, so the ARC one is simply paying the actuarially required contribution.
So that gets up to a little over 200 million in 2036 or thereabouts.
Yeah, and it stays fairly stable, but it, unlike the others, which get to a better funding situation a lot earlier, you're seeing these increased payments, up through 2042.
Okay.
And so it's going to cost the least of these in the short term, but it's going to take the longest before the city feels the, full effects of the budgetary relief that comes from fully funding the pension fund. At the other end of the spectrum is that light blue line. That's if the city's going to not only pay the ARC, but it's going to put $135 million immediately into the pension fund in the next budget and every subsequent budget. You see that costs substantially more in the short term, but by about 2024, you've hit 90% funded, the health of the plan is in much better shape, and costs drop dramatically. And the other approaches are in the middle. I think one difference we do want to highlight is between the city proposal and this $45 million approach we laid out. And the difference is, when do you stop the additional payments? Do you stop at 80% or do you stop at 90% or something higher? And you see for the green line, which is the city proposal, it hits 80% funded. That additional about $48 million in JA and chapter funds, in JA's case, the JA stops paying, and for chapter funds, they go back into providing additional employee benefits. But you have that drop sooner. On the other hand, because you stop those additional payments at 80% rather than 90%, it takes you longer to hit full funding. So there's that first drop when you stop the additional contributions, and then there's that second drop when you hit 100% funded. So if you cut off that flow at 80% funded, it's going to take you longer to get to full funding.
So to say it differently, David, until about 28, somewhere in there, the mayor's proposal and the $45 million proposal are about the same in terms of the amount the city puts in. The debate is what's the source of the $45 million?
Yes.
Correct.
And then under the mayor's proposal, a steep decline, and on the $45 million, not.
Yeah, and under the 45 million, takes a little longer to have that decline, and it's not quite as steep. That both are correct.
And why is that?
Yeah.
Why is that? Because
Because
it's
you-
still the same numbers, right?
Yeah, because you've been putting the money in longer. So it's every time you are overfunding, every time you're putting in more than just the ARC. Not only am I paying down on that.
No, you
Yeah.
missed the question. Why the steep decline with the mayor's proposal and not the steep decline with the 45 million, right there around 2028?
Why wouldn't that be the same?
Well, so there's a steep decline for the 45 million. It's in 2030, 31. It goes from it goes back down to, something on order of 140 million from.
Yeah, but David, why is that pushed out past the green?
So it's the difference between cutting off that funds at 80% funded versus cutting
Oh,
off
so
those
that's
funds
not
at
apples to
90%.
apples.
So the cities is at 80%?
Cities is 80%.
Okay, so if it were at 90%, it'd be identical.
Yeah.
Okay,
So, one of the questions obviously is how much?
right.
Second question is where does it come from? We don't, as said, don't have any great ability to, help drive that discussion in Jacksonville, but is obviously one of deep importance. And then the third one is when do you turn off that spigot? And you turn it off at
Right.
80%, 90%. And so we wanted
Right.
to show that difference here.
So we could view for purposes of funding, the number, it's the same.
Yes.
It's just the source of payments. So that's actually works out to look pretty good, because now we can see, well, there's an issue on 80% or 90%. So that shows us not disregarding the source, that shows us what would happen. Okay, great.
Did we not say 80% was the aim? I thought
We said we changed it in the governance paper to 90% because of the ordinance, and I made a mistake. I probably should have asked David to do it at both 80 and 90%, but this does it for us.
Well, and I wanted to show one example where it's between the two. I guess 2 points that I want to make is that going above and beyond the ARC is good policy. And if you want to go to 80% or 90%, both are acceptable. But this one shows the difference between the two. On one hand, you get to cut off those additional payments and get that budgetary relief a little earlier. On the other hand, you're paying a little more in total.
So
this is-
David, if we decided, let's say the 45 million for purposes of argument, and looking at on page 2, and we chose to do 80% rather than 90%, in 2028-ish, we dropped down to 140 million across and then drop down. So is that what that's saying? Okay, all right. Okay.
David, can you go back to the slide that you had right before that one? No, you were on it. So the area between the dotted curve and the arc right there is the additional funding, and the savings is the difference between the arc line and the green line or the dotted line, depending on which one you choose.
Yeah, so, until you get to, depends on when you hit that point, 80% or 90%, you're paying more, and the increase that the green line or the purple line are above, that's what you paid more, whether it's from JA funds or from property tax or sales tax. And then, then your funding levels drop and you're saving money, and that's, so everything beyond that point, the difference between the ARC line, that blue line, and either the purple or the green, is the amount you've saved.
Charlie?
A little bit of refinement to the answer to that question, Bob. I think it's, what you said is correct, but you have to deduct the difference in the earlier years. Because in those years from 2014 to approximately 26 or something, we're paying more, but we're saving out of the future. So it's the net of that is the way I view that.
I'm glad we've got you guys on this committee. All right, so would you explain that from the different, let's take the green line. The ARC is the one with the black dot in it.
Yeah.
So those are the savings on the right-hand side, that difference. But I get, Charlie, you have to net it out on the increase too. So the net of that
Right's the benefit,
is the
the
same.
left is the additional
Right,
cost.
right. So then, David, you may be doing this. So what's the benefit of 80% versus 90%? Is there a significant enough savings to go from 90 to 80?
There's
Or from 80 to 90?
a small increase in savings, and you get to higher funding levels faster. But there's not. We wanted to show both options so the task force could consider. It's not a
Not-
great difference either way.
Okay, all right, great. Wait, Sherry, yep. No, go ahead. Squatters' rights.
So the line between 2014 and 2028, those three lines are really kind of surprise to me, because why not just do the ARC? I mean, we're going to wrestle on the revenue side. The greatest amount the city pays is 2034, and it's just a little over 200 million. Is it because of the city's bond rating, it better positions us there? Help me get that. Make the argument for that.
Okay, so the argument for is that, two things. One, you're giving the plan a buffer. Right now, we're 39% funded, or the plan is 39% funded. Getting out of that hole faster means that it's going to be more robust. There's going to be a recession in the future. There's going to be challenges in the future. This gives it, a bigger buffer. It gives it liquidity. It gives it a lot of things that make it better able to weather future fiscal storms. That we know that the economy varies and that things will happen in the future. Second, just like paying credit card debt faster, you reduce the interest. If you pay this down faster, you're giving the funds more funds to invest, and you're going to get the benefits from that.
So retirees could do better, theoretically.
Retirees could, the city will do better. The promise has been made to retirees. Obviously, if you get the plan fully funded, if you avoided having to have, retirees having to worry about, and current employees having to worry about, task forces and processes like these trying to figure out tough solutions. But, the real gain is both making sure that the plan is going to be, in a more stable position, and spending more in the short run to save more in the long run.
Well, the other part of this, Sherry, don't forget, this is on a 7% return, and what really drove this was what if the return were 5.4%, because then those numbers go up.
But it
So-
also better positions the city financially.
Right,
But David, the real thing is that you get to, if you follow the green line, you get to 80% funded, or the dotted line, you get to 80% funded in 2030, and if you follow the ARC, you don't get to 80% funded until 2043.
right.
So, you have a lot hanging out for 20 years if you follow the ARC.
Well, close. So the ARC gets the 80% funded in 2036. The city proposal, or the paying the $45 million, gets you there in 2028. But in both cases, you're getting to a better funding status, not a full funding status, but you're getting to a better funding status, or 8 years in advance.
Greg was next, and then Charlie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just wanted to clarify, this is only the police and fire pension fund. It doesn't include the other
Does not
funds at
include,
all. So that's something for the committee to consider. The second thing is, I'm just interested in the rough calculations. The city proposal was 40 million extra contributions plus the chapter funds, half of the chapter funds, which was essentially 5 million. So it's essentially 45 million either way, but the city proposal just includes that 5 million.
Yeah, I mean, the chapter funds start a little smaller than grow over time,
Yeah.
or projected to, but.
So if
it's
we
roughly
included the
equivalent.
chapter funds in a proposal with the 45 million, it would go to 49, right? So it'd go quicker, right?
I'm sorry, the 45, I'm sorry, I'm a little thick on this. The 45 does or does not include the chapter funds?
I don't think it does.
To any of
The
these?
45, so the city proposal includes the chapter funds.
Okay.
Because that's how the city's proposed getting to that, that contribution
Right.
target.
That's 40 plus 5, though.
40
That's
plus
40
5.
Right,
So it's the 148 to that number.
yep, yep.
It's current.
John, can't hear you. What?
It's 148 currently, so it's adding that 45 to
Yes.
that.
Right. Charlie?
And a question for you. We've discussed certain recommendations that this panel will likely make in terms of, which we discussed earlier, in terms of COLA benefits and other things that we discussed. This does not have any of those changes in there.
It doesn't have the ones discussed today.
Okay.
It has all the others that were discussed last week. So this includes reducing COLAs prospectively for current employees, and it includes, the proposed changes to new employees, and it includes the increasing employee contributions up to 10% for current employees.
When you say it includes, that means the city proposal?
All of these,
All of them.
everything but that yellow baseline scenario
Okay.
includes the pieces that have been voted on by the
The
task force
design,
already.
right. Okay, Charlie?
I mean, to me, Sherry's point about why don't we just do the ARC contributions, which is certainly a relevant statement there.
So it's a question, not a
Yeah,
statement.
I understand. But to me, I mean, the other piece of this is, we know with the negotiation settlement agreement, there has to be consent on both sides of this until and unless the 30-year agreement is resolved. To me, the reason, the quid pro quo, we've talked about this at the very beginning, is it needs to be shared sacrifice among all the various parties involved in this. To our public safety employees, if we're going to agree to, let's just say, to commit 45 million additional dollars, wherever that source comes from, whether it's the JEA, increase in sales tax or increase in property taxes, whatever it might be. I think, to me, you look at this as a package and you say, we're willing to ask the citizens and residents of Duval County to step up to the plate to get you a much stronger pension plan so you don't have any concern about your future benefits. And
That's the idea.
in
Yeah.
exchange for that, we're asking you to make these other changes that we're recommending, because we can't force those changes on our public safety employees. But there needs to be a quid pro quo. I mean, to me, the quid pro quo is that, and I'm in favor of the 80%, not the 90% for all the reasons we've discussed before, but I think it's to me, this is a very compelling slide, is what the right thing to do. In essence, we're making approximately $200 million contributions, which is, this is where we were a while ago. And we got to find the funding source for that, and there's any number of ways we can do that, which is well summarized in the paper today, as a matter of fact. But the reason we want to do that is because it makes it a better plan, it makes it a more secure plan for, I'll say public safety, we're only talking about pension and fire, but to council
Right.
member's point, it needs to be considered for all of our pension
That's,
plans.
it's all of this. It's the governance changes. It's all of that that go into it.
To
It's
me,
the
that's
investment. It's a whole package. That's
It's
the
a
way
whole
I,
package that needs to be considered, not to pull a piece out here, don't make the government changes, or not these changes, or don't do the
Right.
funding.
It's
To
the-
me, our recommendation is, you really need to take the whole package, because the whole package is being considered.
right.
Yeah, and Bill, I guess I absolutely agree with that, and I am thinking, Charlie, about how this task force communicates to the general public. So the rationale. So that obviously is part of it, and the audience for that are retirees and current employees. But that larger contextual piece about the bond rating position of the city is critically important to this. And I think we do a disservice to the general public if we don't contextualize this,
Right.
and we are in trouble And we need to signal that we're being responsible and taking care of this business and protecting employees while we do it.
Right.
Question.
Carl? Yeah.
David, in looking at the very earliest years on the chart, it shows it going down from 14 to, 17? See the dip on the arc. Okay, and that's with the 45 million additional in it?
So that dip is, so one of the changes that was made, or that was proposed and the task force voted on, was to switch from a 23-year closed period to a 30-year period with these annual bases, going back to the old way that the Police and Fire Pension Fund did it through 2011. And so that changes how the ARC is going to get calculated going forward. It's going to, save a little in the short term. It's going to push out costs further. So if you look at the yellow line spikes up to above 400 million, and then drops down because it's paying it off over this 23-year period. Paying the ARC, it carries it forward through 2042 or 2044 until things are fully funded. So it's, I think that's the impact of the change you're seeing. Also, that 2014 number it's based on everything that's happened already. So no matter what you do right now, you're not changing that 2014 number because it's calculated based on how things were in 2012. And so as the benefit changes that were proposed and recommended by this task force are made, you start to see those factor into the numbers in the short term. So I think those are the two reasons you see that dip.
Okay, let me ask Cindy a question. I think we all have been talking about this as a package. I mean, that's the way we've approached it the whole time. So given the legal posture we find ourselves in that we can deal with 3/4 of these issues by recommending directly to the council and to the fund that they reach an agreement, but we can't on the pension design part of it. So how would that, let's say that we did our report, we recommended that it was all of a piece. How would if so then, could the city then go to the unions, I suppose it would have to be, not the fund, given Judge Wallace's order, and say, okay, here's what we want to propose, we want to collectively bargain this, let's say in the next month, and they could either say yes or no. How does that procedurally work so that the council has a piece that it can put together in time for the budget?
Is that all? You're right that it would start with the executive branch collectively bargaining with the union. So that we will go back to them because the rights that they waived last time, they are entitled to make a decision whether they want to collectively bargain or waive those, or to maintain a position that neither one is pertinent to them. And so the first stop is with the unions to see which of those three options they choose. If there is something worth collectively bargaining, then in their mind, then we would sit down and bargain that through the executive branch, make a recommendation to the city council in a shade meeting.
And how long does that number one process take?
It depends. If we're bargaining it, then it could take a bit because it's ultimately going to be something that goes to vote to the union membership.
To the union,
All right, that's
okay,
the key,
right.
is when something is bargained, is it goes to a vote of the union membership.
So suppose the two teams can't agree.
If they,
So then can you immediately go to impasse?
no. If you collectively bargain, the next step then is to ask for a special magistrate to be appointed to attempt to resolve the parties, ironically through first a mediation. Secondly, yes, back to where we started. And then secondly, through a special master. And then ultimately back if the city accepts or rejects the recommendations and the union accepts or rejects the recommendations of the special master. And then from that point forward, it would be ready to go to city council if there were either an agreement for the city council to bless or an impasse hearing. And if there were an impasse hearing, then that moves forward through, again, another round of votes.
To the city council. That's like a mini trial.
It
Okay.
is. So this is, as you can see, a lengthy, detailed proceeding.
And is there an appellate right?
Yes, from PERC, from the public body that deals with these matters up to the First District Court of Appeal.
So I know Greg's got a question, but let me just pose one other thing. Even taking Judge Wallace's order, could the union say, we waive our right to collectively bargain? Then what happens?
The unions are always entitled to waive their right to collectively bargain. Now, the question is if they do it again, whether they'll get sued or collateral people will get sued. They did it last time, you can't do it clearer than they did it, and Judge Wallace nonetheless found they hadn't. So other than that kind of mind-bending issue, they certainly have the right under Florida law to waive that, and if so, then they're letting the process go on their own. They're letting the city fight it out, and there's a more informal, really a political process where people get to come to the podium, spend their 3 minutes explaining why it's good or
Wait,
bad.
but you're going too fast now. Suppose they waived it.
Yes.
So then our whole proposal would go to the city council. And
It's a-
how would, how,
don't
what's
forget
the,
the fund.
how does that work?
Don't forget the fund, okay?
Okay.
Because we had that, okay? We had a waiver from the unions, and we didn't, and from the fund. But once we had the waiver first from the unions, or the refusal to bargain, which we interpreted as a waiver, then had we an agreement with the fund, we could move forward. But you need both. You have a resolution with the union and a resolution with the fund. Either one can stop you dead in your tracks, and you have different litigation routes to address them.
So Cindy and I talked about this over the weekend, and it's under the I think what we said, under the Constitution, it's the employee who has the constitutional right to collectively bargain. What Judge Wallace, in a sense, did out of the newspaper suit was to say that the taxpayers have a right to collectively bargain, which is not in the Constitution. So, Greg, you got a question? I'm trying to get us to see how the procedure works.
And it's very helpful, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for that. Cindy, I don't know whether I can ask this question or not. Tell me if I can't.
Okay, you certainly can. You can't ruin yourself for the hearing by asking a question, so.
Excellent. When this comes to a collective bargaining or to a discussion, does it come in individual components, or can it come based on whatever instruction as a package? So whether is it either an up or down on the package, or do you begin to sort of to dissect the recommendations and negotiate individual recommendations?
There's a strategy involved, and it depends on whether the executive branch's goal is to have them all resolved at once. Sometimes there are severable issues in collective bargaining. There might be workforce issues, for example, hours and shifts, and then you might have salary issues. And so you might bargain one separately, and then the other, sometimes you tie them together. So if it's on pension, the likely recommendation would be that it's an all or nothing, and you approach it with what you call TA. You're temporarily approving each issue like any complex litigation settlement. You say, we agree on this part. Now, we're not bound to this part unless we agree on all of the others. So you kind of...
Exactly. So again, I really want to get back to the process. So let's say, is Randy here today? Steve is here. So Steve, if I asked you right now,
Well, be careful of...
I'm not asking about
Unfair
pension
labor
design, I'm not.
practices.
I'm asking, suppose I asked him, would the police union waive on behalf of its members today the right to, setting aside all the...
No, cannot. You can't
Okay,
ask
I'm
him that.
not-
It would be an
all
unfair
right.
labor practice.
Hypothetically, I want to know the process, that's all. I'm not asking him to waive it.
Just ask her.
Okay,
Ask him
Cindy,
what the
okay,
process is
Cindy,
in-
if I
in-
asked the union if they would waive the right to collectively bargain and consider what we propose in total context, what happen if they could do that, which don't know that they can, but if they could, where would you go would it then all go to the city council? Or how does that work?
Let's,
Are we dead anyway?
okay, let's back it up a little bit. Under the Florida statutes and the Constitution, the only entity that can collectively bargain with the unions is the executive branch, the mayor as designee. So whatever reports you have goes back to the mayor as the CEO of the city. It's a recommendation from the task force. The task force cannot collectively bargain, can't ask somebody if they're going to waive anything. Very intricate rules in this to protect everybody's rights, including the cities. This is not just to their benefit. So let's say you come out with a recommendation. You transmit the recommendation to the mayor with saying you would be happy with this, and then the question to the mayor is, okay, how does he, if he agrees, how does he go about seeking to get that? And how he would go about would be to kind of put it together with counsel and to...
With what?
With counsel, with
Okay.
legal counsel, and
Yep.
there's some strategy and there's some basic process you go through. And then we would make a proposal. We'd notice a collective bargaining meeting in the sunshine. They would have had a chance to look at the proposal and would sit down and would go through it. Now, if on transmitting it to them, they decided they're not engaging, they're going to leave it in the political process, then they can tell us they waive. It doesn't have to be in any formalized, and it's not in the sunshine, it's not a sunshine issue. And that would be the decision of the council presidents respectively. They know their membership, and they're making a call not to not engage, but not to engage formally as a union through the litigation process. They still have the right. They have not agreed to it. They've waived their right to bargain it. So that would then leave them in a political process where individual members can come up at the podium as the city attempts to do something, assuming it had an agreement with the fund. Is that largely it? Kirsten,
Okay.
Kirsten's a
agree with
labor
that.
law
Yeah, I
expert
agree.
also.
All right, so that sort of tells us it's convoluted, but I think she said that if we got to the point where they wanted to put it in the political process, they could. So our job is to get our recommendations.
To the mayor.
Yep.
Mhm.
It might be helpful just to know the timing. How long do each party have? That'll, I think.
There's no set time for the decision to waive or collectively bargain. You need to be fair and reasonable. This would be a complex matter. There may be matters that the union wants to meet privately with its membership to gauge before they decided whether to waive or not. So what would be a reasonable time? A minimum of a few weeks, and it could be, it could be substantially longer. We'd have to sit down with them and see, because most of the membership has not been able to keep up with this while they're, earning their livings.
Yeah, I think it's important to us to understand this context, but in fairness to the unions, they need to know who to negotiate with, because they're not standing up here to negotiate with us, because they got to negotiate down the road. I can't blame that a bit about that, Kirsten.
Is how or whether the city decides to manage the unfunded liability, is that a mandatory subject of bargaining?
No, that's a very good point, Ms. Doolittle. The two separate issues. One is the value of the pension benefits. The decision to accelerate a payment, whether unilaterally or for some reason under a contract, that's not a bargainable issue, at least in my estimation.
Yeah, that's a different issue, but if you're doing it in the context of the whole, it becomes...
No, never. You can't convert non-bargainable issues.
No,
to
I'm not saying it's
bargainable
bargaining, but in terms of timing, if you're not going to give this until you decide that, then you've got the issue.
issues. Well, they'd certainly be aware of this additional payment, but there's a reason that such things are not bargainable, that typically they're just not the issue
Right.
for the people. I want to know what are my benefits and what are your obligations to pay them.
Okay, no, I get that, okay. Charlie?
That's all been very helpful context. I think it's also, you were asking the optimistic question
Right.
as to how we could make this go forward. But the other way is, the other hypothetical is, we come up with our recommendations and it goes to the administration, and the administration takes all the steps that you spoke of, and the union and/or the fund says no.
Right.
Then you would continue with the lawsuit, because you attempted to mediate the lawsuit.
Yes,
Then the lawsuit would continue, and there's either a winner or a loser in that lawsuit.
yes.
And if the 30-year agreement were found to be unenforceable through the lawsuit, then you come back to the collective bargain issue direct with the union. And if the 30-year agreement is found to be binding, then you're back to negotiating with the fund. And there's a risk to all parties to how that ultimately is resolved.
Right.
That's correct.
No question about it. So I'm not sure I understand where that leaves us, other than to say if we go over to the federal court and says everybody's agreed with it, then you sign the judgment and you go on from that. So, but I don't know if Judge Wallace's, well, I don't think Judge Wallace's order would be preempted by whatever a federal judge wanted to do. So,
One would have thought that before you issued the order.
right. Okay, so all that is a digression, and I understand that it was away from what the money decision was. I think this chart here is very helpful. David, do you want to continue on? I'm not sure we need it, or maybe we do. Let's go on through your presentation, and we can talk about where
And
we
I'll go quickly, simply just presenting this. Ultimately, then, that'll give more time for both questions and for discussion. This is simply how funding levels improve over time under the different paths. I think this is really the three things that are most helpful to see. So yellow is the baseline, and you see it goes up faster than the arc. Why is that? Well, because one of the changes that both Robert DeZube and Pew recommended was, in the past, Jacksonville used a 30-year period to try to pay off its pension debt. This is standard practice in state and local plans. After 2011, the actuary for the funds collapsed all those into one 23-year period, led to that big spike we saw, something that was going to both create a substantial burden on the city in 1 year and then create a giant windfall the next year. And so, smoothing it out means you get to that full funding slower, but it does keep the city from having to make a sharp spike in contributions. And then the green line is the city proposal, simply showing, well, if you just pay the ARC, it takes you longer to get the full funding. But if you do the ARC Plus, if you put supplemental contributions in, it really speeds up that process of getting to a better funding situation. So this is simply comparing the different approaches. One thing you see is simply by going from baseline to pay the ARC, so incorporating the different changes that were discussed in the task force, COLAs, employee contributions. The city's contribution goes down substantially, something on the order of $655 million from 2014 to 2044. So that's simply the result of benefit cuts and employee contribution increases.
So, David, is the savings number to 100% or to 80%?
That's the amount that you've saved in employer contributions from 2014 to 2044.
So that's the 100%.
Yeah.
Those are undiscounted full dollars.
Those are inflation adjusted. So these are 2014 dollars.
So it's discounted at 7%.
Discounted at the projected inflation, so discounted at 2.5%. Secondly, if you look between pay the ARC and the city proposal, you see the savings you get from putting more in on the front ends and being able to pay less in the back end. And so you see something that's on the order of 375 million. And so this is just showing that if you pay it faster, you get some substantial long-term savings for the city. You also get the fund to a better shape faster. So if you just pay the ARC, you get to 80% funded in 2036. If you do the city proposal or the 45 million proposal, you get to 100% funded, 2035 or 2037. So putting more in, going above and beyond simply making ARC payments is both going to save money and it's going to improve the funding status of the plan. So these are the charts looking at a situation with 5.4% returns. The short version is that they're all costs are substantially higher if returns fall short of what's expected. You can see here if you just pay the ARC, you get to 80% funded by 2044. So even though you're putting money in, because you're losing money by falling short of investment targets each year, you don't get to 100% funded. The $45 million approach, you know, because you're still having losses, you don't get to 100% funded, but you're getting close to the high 90s. So going above and beyond the ARC would be meaningful in terms of if there is shortfalls, if there are investment losses, putting more money into it to help cushion the fund against that. These are the summary figures once again. And
So David, let me go back to chart, or the table on page, first table, page 7. The left-hand column says $45 million supplemental contribution till 90% funded. That shows a savings of 1013, which is different from the city proposal. What's that difference, and what would be the difference if that were 80% rather than 90%?
if it was 80%, it would be about the same. So it's,
Okay.
you know,
that's
the
what-
real difference is the timing. You know, the city proposal does put a little bit more in each year before it gets to 80% funded. So 40 million plus the chapter funds is a little bit more than 45 million. So that's one difference, and the other difference is the timing. The $45 million supplemental ends up, I believe, better funded at 2044 and hits 100% funded earlier.
So to ask a stupid question, if we did 45 million plus the chapter funds, that'd be quicker, that'd be more, obviously. Right, okay, all right, good. Questions?
David,
Sure.
I don't know what page this is, but the comparison of funding approaches 5.4% return, the chart, so the underfunding in 22, you want to explain that to us?
Yeah, so this is because obviously if assumptions go right and, you know, you pay the ARC or you pay the ARC plus, you're going to get to full funding. But if you're having investment losses or investment shortfalls each year, you're not going to get to full funding under any of these, simply because they're based on plan assumptions, and if plan assumptions aren't correct, you know, these funding approaches don't get you there. Now, if you had 20 years of 5.4% 5.4% investment returns, obviously that would be an occasion for the fund and for the city to look at assumptions and to look at policies and to try to make some changes. So we're assuming things just stay as they are, which is not what would actually happen. But so this is the unfunded liability, so the pension debt at the end of the period. So, you know, if you paid the ARC and, you know, made all the changes that were discussed, in 2044 there'd be a pension debt of $472 million, which is obviously a lot less than the current pension debt. So in any of these scenarios, you're in much better funding shape, but you do end up with an unfunded liability, and that needs to be factored in when you're comparing the different approaches.
In perpetuity, it looks like.
Well, I mean, and
It says never.
Never.
Right.
oh, well, yeah, so if you pay the ARC, you never get to 100% funded, but you also would at some point recognize that, you know, the plan, I believe it's every 5 years, does experience studies. You know, there's a process by which they look at their assumptions, and if they're systematically missing the mark in one way or the other, they're going to change them. You know, there's a process for that.
Other questions? So, just thinking out loud in terms of some sort of process, I think right now we're not considering sources of funds. So we need to come up with a number plus the percentage to which we would like to see the number apply, 80% or 90%. So let's talk about that a little bit. Let's have some discussion about that.
I know we're not talking about funds, but obviously you know, to the extent that chapter funds are being considered, you know, it might be useful to think of that as part of the broad array of benefit cuts that are being thought about, you know, just like, you know,
Yeah, assuming you feel like that's part of the employees as opposed to part of the cities, which is a philosophical divide between what Cindy has told us and what Mr. King has told us. We don't necessarily need to concede that.
But, you know, to the extent that those changes, or that is a funding source,
Right.
until you hit that point where you turn the spigot off, employees will see less in those ad hoc benefit increases.
Sure. Okay, so let's talk about let's talk, I think the easiest way maybe to talk about the 80% versus 90% first. So what's y'all's feelings about that? Charlie, I think that was a hand raised.
Yeah, I'm in favor of the 80% as opposed to the 90%. There's a lot of assumptions, as we've been inundated with the actuarial and other assumptions that goes into these calculations. And to me, the only thing we know for sure is that the charts we have here are wrong. Ultimately, they will not happen anywhere it will be on the chart somewhere, but it will not happen in the way it's calculated here, because it's going to be better, it's going to be worse, it's not going to be exactly on. And because of the unknown nature of that, to me, I don't think we want to overshoot. So to me, 80% is a more rational goal to get to, as opposed to, I think it's a little bit too tight, in my opinion.
Okay, others?
Mr. Chairman, I thought we voted on that, so I guess that's the question is, what's changed why is it even on?
I think what changed was probably my misunderstanding of where we were. I think what the ordinance says is that you cannot enhance the benefits until 90% funding is provided for. So when we talked about it the last time, there was general nodding. So that's what we put in terms of the duration of the 30-year agreement, in terms of the obligation to fund. But what that really is an enhancement of benefits. So it'd be consistent to say the city will do this funding on this basis until 80%. That's perfectly consistent. So in drawing the final recommendations, we would say that. That's the reason for that.
Aren't they two different things, though? At the 90%, we are enhanced benefits.
Correct.
And we're trying to deal with a problem that.
The funded
existed,
part.
so.
That's exactly right. So in other words, ignore the 90% in the document now. Right. So, other comments? Are you bashful, or do you agree with Charlie? Bill?
We have agreed with Charlie, haven't we? Isn't that what we're going
Do we have agreement with Charlie?
Yeah.
All right. So by common consent, we're unanimously in agreement with the 80% level. Right? Kirsten?
Yes, but I also just want to add, not because we think Charlie's very smart, but because,
He is.
and he is.
disclaimer.
I'm so glad I'm sitting right next to him. But also, I mean, for the first, few months of this process, we were constantly being told, from a best practices standpoint, that 80% was your mark.
Right.
And, it wasn't until we got this additional information
Right.
that we started considering the 90%. But I think, this entire journey has been premised on this factual predicate that 80% was the best practice.
Yes, I'm afraid the chair probably confused the process, so I will take the blame for that. So 80% is the level we want to go to. The funding period to get to 80%, we would continue this. Okay, so now let's talk about the number. We're not talking about sources yet, but let's talk about the number. So, thoughts? Okay.
On slide 3, I thought I understood the assumptions until all of a sudden I looked at it. And I think the assumption is, and we know why the city proposal and the 45 million proposal are approximately the same, because the contributions is approximately the same. But in those cases, if it's the ARC plus the 45 million until we achieve 80% funding, why do we see the gap between the ARC and those lines narrow? Because we don't get to 80% funding until 2026 or something like that. It seemed like there would be a $45 million delta between those lines, but I don't see that.
But if I'm paying more than the ARC, if I'm just paying the ARC in 2014, then I'm on this path of slowly reaching full funding in 2044. If I say I'm going to do more than that, I'm going to, in 2014 I'm going to put in more than the bare minimum, then in 2015 when the actuaries are doing the calculation, they go, well, we're doing better than that. We're better funded than we expected. That means our payment, the ARC next year is going to be a little smaller.
So the ARC line changes.
The ARC line changes.
Okay, that's the part that I missed on that. And similarly, the way this is defined is the ARC plus 45 million, or 40 to 45 million. And if there were investment gains or losses, that may also adjust the ARC line So we would continually be just readjusting that number if we were to adopt one of those two, the approximately 40 to 45 million. That number is going to go up and down based upon the investment returns also.
Correct.
And at the end of the day, when you get to the 80% is going to be determined by that, and that's the
That's
time you
correct.
cut it off, right, at the end of the day. Okay. Other comments? Anybody else want to say anything? And nobody's proposed a number yet. Yes.
And recall, one of the things that the subcommittee had suggested, and I think maybe for simplicity, was it might be easier to focus on a dollar amount versus on an arc, because you can never figure out what's going on
Right.
as that evolves, to your point.
That's right.
And if you look at those, I mean, I thought the slide 9, that slide, 5.4%, yeah, slide 8. 8? Yeah, 8. I mean, if you were just to visually look across, we don't have the numbers to go with the lines, but it looks like, to Charlie's comment, $200 million is sort of like the fixed amount, right? And what we did in a large sense, the reason we got rid of that big $400 million spike is because we said, well, we won't pay it off as fast. But we
Right.
we don't want to not use that, so we want to overpay, and the 200 looks like, a number that might be.
So this is a number above the 148 again. That's what we're talking about, right?
Yeah, although David, I think, expressed it as a flat 200, so you'd pay 200 less whatever, less the 148. Right. So that'd be 52 million plus the, you're right. So would you say let's say that.
Ideally, it would be the number so that the number never has to go up as long as you earn at least an average of 5.4. That's
Right.
what we're solving for, but visually, it looks like
Right.
200 to 205 or something.
Right. So is that too restrictive, or is that,
Can you explain it again for the
Yep.
slower of us in the room?
No, I mean, so looking at that slide, what we were trying to do is the subcommittee said it's easier to pick a dollar amount. And so on a question of affordability, let's also set a dollar amount that has a very low chance of surprising us. So let's use the 5.4 to figure what our fixed dollar amount is for our budget. And then this incorporates the later thinking that says, but you know what, we can pay it off later, so let's get a solid fixed budget that we just pay off over prudent but not short standards. And so to those objectives, the question is, which of those lines do it? It looks like $200 million, if paid every year until you reach 80% funding, might be a level payment, which would never require a payment greater than that as long as you earn 5.4. Now, probably David or Robert could give us that exact number, but it's somewhere visually 200 to 205 is sort of what it looks like.
No, I would note that any of the, so if you look at any of those dotted lines, anything that goes above and beyond the arc, it may go up. So if you look at the arc only, that blue line with the black diamonds, it goes up and it peaks somewhere in the, maybe 240 million area. It keeps going up. Any of the lines where you pay above and beyond, some of them go up a little bit, but paying more than the arc overfunding gives you at least some of that cushion, even if it is arc plus something.
But David, the way that line goes, following David's sense of this, which I see too, if you stay level right around 200, I mean, what we have to do dips down, so you're doing
If you
better
avoid that
over
dip.
time. If we use that as the dollar figure target, Bill, regardless of the source of funding.
So-
And it looks like within 15 years, we're at 80%, which is a very simple way, in a sense, to explain a lot of complicated information to the public and to the rest of the world. In 15 years, we're
We're done.
80% funded, and the public's contribution is basically $200 million year in and year out.
And the probability of that is 75-25, as opposed to 50-50 on the side. Right, very conservative. Right. So for those of us who are having difficulty visually, if we paid $200 million a year, which line is that?
None of those are precisely 200 million a year. It would look the closest to
Okay.
the purple line.
See, I guess I'm having trouble distinguishing the colors.
It's the
purple
city,
and the
it's
green
the city
overlap.
plan and the
It's the city / 45 million, right. But I guess I'm having trouble seeing which one that is. Okay.
Yes, if you look at the purple lines,
Got it.
that's the closest to
Okay.
it. But it would be a little bit more in the short term, and a little bit less in the long term.
So that since we're now going to have another meeting, by then we will have focused this so much that you could have meaningful charts and savings and all that kind of stuff for us.
You could bring us home to 205 or 210 or 200, right?
Let's,
Yeah, I mean, I think given this,
let's don't get him, we need to start bringing it to an end, but, so, Yeah,
and
to
all
the
of
right
this, you know, if the ARC ends up exceeding whatever that fixed payment is, you know, I mean, one, good policy
We're in
says you
trouble.
need to pay that ARC. Two,
Right.
Florida law says you need to pay that ARC.
right. Sure. So it'd be it would be the higher of the 200 or the ARC.
Or
Right.
55 or
Right.
whatever, ARC plus.
Right.
Does that mean
Right,
what you're
but we
saying?
have a 75% probability that the ARC is not going to
It
go
would-
above
it would be
that,
the higher of, let's say, 205 million or 200 million.
or the ARC, that's right.
And
Mr. Chair.
until you
Right.
hit 80% funded, and then you go back down to simply paying the ARC. I think
Right.
that's
Bob?
what I'm hearing.
You know, I think to David's point, the simplicity of being able to do that instead of every year having to wait until the ARC's determined and then what are we gonna do, that just, you know, that looks like a nightmare.
Okay. So, Carl?
Yeah, I think it needs to, a point needs to be made that almost 75% of this has already been done. We're talking about 200 million, but the council in the last 2 years has taken the big bite of that. They've already done 148 of that million. Now
But that's still the ARC.
It's
That's
the
the
ARC.
ARC.
That is the ARC, but we're not talking about an additional 200 million, we're talking about an additional 50.
50.
And
That's
so
right.
I think the public, if we start talking 200 million, they're gonna think we're hitting them another 200, and we're not. We're talking about going, that really heavy lifting happened between 7 or 8 years ago when it was 25 million to becoming 148 million. And that's where all the pain came from for the city's budget.
Sure.
So I just wanted to make that point that 3/4 of it has already been done,
Yes.
with a property tax increase primarily.
Go, in the past, right?
In the
that's
past.
right. Right. Hold on, Charlie. Anybody else besides Charlie at this point? Want to hear from everybody? Charlie?
Yeah, mine actually was about the same as Carl's, and that is, you know, I would be in favor of saying, we know the city budget last year had a $148 million pension contribution included, and we met the requirements that we felt we had to meet. The city council felt they did, and the administration did. If we say, look, we think the contribution should be $200 million a year, and that the city budget could handle 150. So the obvious math is the shortfall is a $50 million funding, and where's that to come from, which is the next step.
Right.
I mean, that to me is a logical progression of what we have to
That's-
decide.
That's exactly right.
And so, you know, I think that 200 and the 150 contribution, and that to me what our motion should be, and then we can move on to how we get to the 50.
That's what I thought too, and we'll let you make that motion if you'd like it. We probably ought to let Mr. Greg Anderson make that motion, but we. Maybe Gwen should make it as a former council person.
Is it 200 or is it a number you're going to come back with,
It's-
is maybe 205 or?
Well, and I
The
think-
chair would prefer we settle on a number today, because otherwise we're going to drift forever. So, Greg? Yep.
I'm not suggesting one way or the other, but when I looked at the chart, the 7% chart, because I was thinking through kind of where we would, it's the next step that really is the hard. I mean, we can come up with this number, but in some ways, we really ought to be realistic about how we're going to get there. And the $45 million number seemed to accomplish an awful lot, and that's been the plan, the mayor's plan. Proposed 45 million. Most of the charts that we've seen have kind of run those numbers. So I understand where the committee may go, but the 45 million had some interest in my mind.
Okay. So is there a motion? I don't think we ever made one, and we can discuss it. Charlie, you made you did not make it. Would anyone like to make a motion? So let's go home. Someone like to make a motion? I heard 200 million, and then I heard Greg say, well, maybe we ought, sort of consistent with what Carl and Charlie were saying in the real world, we're saying 50 plus, say 50, 45 or $50 million above the arc? Is that what, then it fluctuates? Is that what that does? All right.
I'll make a motion.
Okay,
Well, maybe you need to clarify first.
okay.
Well, I think we discussed why we don't want to tie it to an amount over the arc because of the
That's-
complications involved with that.
I'm pushing you, that's right.
Yeah, I
right.
think we ought to, and I'm certainly fine with 195 versus 200 or 190 versus 200. To me, the 190 to 200 is the range that I think we need to be at. And that's why I didn't make the motion, because I'm certainly fine at 195 with an assumption of 150 already being funded, in essence, which is the 45 differential. I'm fine anywhere in that range.
Okay, Sherry?
Okay, well, I mean, we can do this as a range, or we can do it as a target. I mean, I would move that the task force adopt a recommendation that the city of Jacksonville make a contribution at the level of $200 million annually until this is, the unfunded liability reaches 80% funded.
Okay, is there a second to that? Then we can discuss it. Bill seconds. Okay, Kirsten, did you want to? Okay, discussion. Are you ready to vote? Carl?
From a practical standpoint, I'm sitting here looking at Greg's face.
I am too. I am too.
You know, when they get down to their budgets every year, $2 or $3 million
Makes a lot.
is the difference in funding children's services. So I know we have a motion on the floor, but I'm a little more comfortable with it.
You can move to amend it to be 190.
I might amend it to 190 million.
Is there a second to the motion? Second, when?
Well, again, perhaps maybe we ought to do the range as suggested. Let's look at the next set of discussion and see, because some of these funding things are, as we know, are somewhat debate.
All right, so would you like, I'm going to take that, would you take that as an amendment of a range of 190 to 200? And the seconder, okay, all right. And so are you ready? So that's been moved and seconded as an amendment. Is there discussion on the amendment? You want to talk
The
about,
discussion is on whether we give a range.
oh, range or not?
I think, as we wrestle with flexibility, right? The risk in not stepping up to the number that might come under one calculation is we could be surprised and have to come back and do more later. And so it's just whether you want to sort of take a point that you know you're comfortable with and you put it behind you, or do you want to sort of, deal with this in the event you don't get the 5.4. So it's.
Right.
But
I would also just add that, if you're looking at the chart on page 8, most of the payment, if we're looking at this, the green and purple dotted line of the city's plan of 45 million, most of these payments are at or above the 200 level. And I just worry that if we say, let's look at a range, recommending a range of 190 to 200, and the city, given the practical realities they face, they move forward within that 190, we are possibly not being as proactive as we need to be and reducing the liability.
And the chair would just say that they're going to go through whatever process they're going to go, and probably we could be most helpful to be, not us getting into the politics, what is the right thing to do? So that's probably what we ought to do. We ought to,
Is it
Well-
possible that we leave it at the range for now and have the next discussion and then come back and say, based on what we believe, we have a comfort
Sure.
level that it's either 190 or it's
Sure.
200?
without being overly lawyerly and parliamentary, I think you would just move to postpone that till our next discussion, till we conclude the sources.
I'll make that motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye. All opposed. I don't think that's a debatable motion, so, okay. So now we're on to the sources, and there is a memo that has been prepared. I think this is this little chart that everybody, I think it was passed out last time. I tell you what, let's take it's now 2:45. We've been here almost 2 hours. Let's take a break. And Carol, would you make 20 copies of this or 30 copies? And let's come back here at 5 minutes to 3. Thank you all. Okay, let's come back to order. I think everybody is back, are they not? Yep. Okay, we're going to move to the discussion of sources. David Drain just mentioned to me before we go to that the 200 million stable funding does get us to where we wanted. David, you want to articulate that better than I will? That the 200 million, if we fixed that, that would provide a stable.
Yeah, so both Robert and I ran the numbers separately, and both came up with if you had a fixed contribution of 200 million, given all the changes that have already been recommended, even if you had 5.4% returns, you'd have a stable contributions over time. You'd be able to keep that 200% funded until you get 80% funded.
Okay.
Now, just to clarify, this is looking at if things are stable. If you had a 25-30% loss in 1 year, that
Sure.
might be enough to force
Throw it out of
contributions
kilter.
above that.
Right. But again, you've got the 75% chance of probability.
Yeah,
Right.
there's.
So, and y'all didn't run the numbers yet on those two other things yet? Why not?
Sorry.
I'm trying to save the task force another meeting. Okay, let's move to the, I've lost my handouts. Where are my handouts? Carol, did you pass them out? Oh, you did? Okay, there they are. All right, there are two sheets here. One y'all saw last week as sources, the additional JEA funding, the ad valorem taxation, the franchise fee, the fire rescue surtax, and general budget cuts. And then John Wilbanks gave me a list, which is the other list, just so that we don't forget. We also have available chapter funds, the reserve fund of $24.5 million, which was in the mayor's proposal, as I recall, and that was paid down over a couple of years on the JA proposal. Plan design savings, that may change, but I suspect, well, it might with the COLA when they come back. Expected reduction in administrative and legal fees. Y'all recall Tom Madonic said that was $6 million a year. Now, whether that's accurate or not, but that is something. Improved fund performance due to better governance. Property tax, sale of city property. Y'all recall on the sale of city property, that's sort of a one-time thing. And you might apply it 1 year to something, but that is a regular recurring source. That doesn't apply. Other taxes, JA contribution, blah, blah, blah. So, let me just frame it, at least from the chairman's perspective of what I've been thinking. This is not to prejudge anything. This is just to put some things out. On the JEA funding, I think that's intriguing, but that is something that is very unquantifiable at this point. So that down the road, it might be, if the city and the JEA can work something out, that might reduce the city's contribution from the millage rate, that $148 million base. We are not in a position to evaluate that at this point. Again, these are my observations. On the ad valorem taxation, 1 mil would raise almost $45 million. That speaks for itself. The franchise fee, if you increased it, if you doubled it to the maximum capacity, you'd get into the range of the $40 million. And then the surtax on the sales tax, a half cent is $68 million, which is a little bit more than you need, and a full 1 cent is $136 million. I might just say, one thing we talked about doing as it related to funding the unfunded liability is if we did come up with a revenue source, to also make some recommendations on the general employees fund, so that if you think about the sales tax, there's some additional wiggle room to help on the GEPP, either at a half cent or 1 cent, either one. The sales tax, as y'all know, is more regressive, meaning it's really broader, but it does hit everybody. That means everybody's sharing. It also would pick up people coming in who live in St. John's, Baker, Clay counties that live elsewhere and come here and buy products here. Someone was telling me today that there may be 20 million people that pass through Jacksonville, either stay or go through. They might have to stop for gas or buy a candy bar or whatever. So all of that goes into the thinking on the sales tax. On the ad valorem tax, back to that, that is more progressive in that it does impose it on the, what could arguably be said, people better able to afford it. Sherry had sent us an email, though, to remind us that renters pay ad valorem tax too, because landlords raise the rents if they have to pay more taxes. So those are sort of where I see the different parts of this. The general fund budget cuts is another source, which went on here just because it's a source. I think, at least from my perspective, we've cut and cut and cut, and it depends on the quality of life of our city. And I'll say again what I said Friday in a panel discussion with Chris Hand and Tom Madonix, is that you could say that two of the worst decisions that we've made over the past several years, number one in 2001 with the 30-year agreement in and of itself, but the COLAs were, as a part of that, were totally not understood. That was a huge miscalculation. And number two, in my opinion, which y'all are free not to share, is that the decision to reduce the millage rate each year over the long-term good of the city for lots of reasons was one of the worst mistakes we've ever made. And as I mentioned at that panel discussion, that's when I asked the city, I think it was either Joey or Ronnie or maybe Glenn gave me that number, that was $900 million is the differential over the period. That's the equivalent of one city budget. That's incredible. So, to me at least, the other thing, Trip Gulliford, the council president's son, used to work for me, and he's the head of CBRE, which is the commercial real estate folks, and he was saying he goes around on all these marketing trips, and it's really difficult to get people to come to Jacksonville. And one of the things that he observed was young people. We are losing our young people going to Austin, Atlanta, Charlotte, Washington, wherever, but they're not coming back here. So we invest in them in our high schools, and well, in all our schools, and they go, and we've lost that investment. So I asked Sherry if she would consider a proposal. To me, this would be interesting. It's beyond our work, but something to keep in mind, being somewhat elitist, but if you chose Stanford, if you chose Stanton, Bowles, Episcopal, Country Day School, Paxson, those schools, and you went back and analyzed over the last 10 or 15 years where those graduating seniors are, many of them may not be here. And if you further refine that to the top 10% of those classes, you might find it even worse. So all that is to say is that our quality of life, as we think about fiscally putting our house in order, we need to think about qualitatively putting our house, at least setting a platform that we can go forward. Kirsten?
Just on that, I know when we last met, I had asked if we could resurrect, I think someone had given it to us in the past, an analysis or comparative analysis that showed the millage rates in surrounding and comparable counties. Did we get that?
I think I asked for that, but I then forgot about it, and I think we could get it. Joey, do you have the, generally speaking, on the top of your head, you know, generally speaking, where we compare with? Now, you've got to separate it out because we're consolidated government. As it relates to the city millage only, what's the city millage? 11?
11.4419.
Okay, where do we stand compared to the?
Mr. Chair, I know we talked about that last week. I'm still looking into that. If you look at the State Department of Revenue, it's a very complex analysis. I know that we've seen something in the past. I haven't seen that something again. I'm still searching for it. I'll work with the budget office, maybe council auditor's office.
Just on the millage rates. That's not the dollars.
Just
the
millage.
Just millage rate. What's the millage rate?
You know, most of
Well,
Florida in it.
but the trouble is, if you look at different cities in the state of Florida, everybody's got different special districts. Some split out libraries, some split out police and fire, some split out. You can't. It's very tough to do an apples-to-apples comparison. I started looking at that last week, and unfortunately, I haven't been able to make things apples to apples.
But between now and our meeting next week, you will have something that we can see.
I'll try my best.
Thank you.
Bill, I really
know you-
thought the JCCI report did that because it shows special taxing districts.
Sure.
Ad valorem tax, so it tries to do apples to apples, and it doesn't matter how you cut it. We're the cheapest, period. We are.
Okay.
all you want, we are.
Okay, if I'd have brought my big box of all my files, I would have had the JCCI report, which is in one of those files. So,
It's on the website.
all right, well, why don't we start our discussion on the funding sources, and then Sherry will be looking for that. Or maybe, Joey, if you got a computer, or somebody can go looking for the JCCI report. Okay, sources. Who wants to start
Chairman.
this? Yes, Bob?
Are we going to recommend a source? Are we going to give the report a bucket of sources, or a priority of sources, or a single source?
Well, that's of course up to the task force. What I had envisioned is a bucket of sources with a prioritization, because if we can give them ways to do things. But it's up to y'all. I don't really have a real preference.
Well, how about going forward with two potential sources?
Sure. So, would you like to start the discussion?
I just did.
Well, pushing you along, what two sources did you have in mind?
JEA does not seem to be a part of the problem. The problem rests other places. And it seems to me for us to bring them into this equation at this time, that, and I hear this every day when people found out I was on this force. I get more calls than I used to. But most people do not want JEA as a part of the solution to a problem that they had nothing to do with. And our electric rates are a huge part of economic development for our community. And we all know that they have debt, and we all know that the changes in their industry, their utility, are going to be increasingly expensive down the road, and that the funds that they have reserved are necessary for the continuation of their service and keeping Jacksonville a competitive community. All of those things, they've got their own problems. I don't think we should get them more involved in the city problems that were created by city government. And so I'm not in favor of anything that we do that raises money that's applicable to JEA. Let's just leave them out of the equation. I'm in favor of other funding sources to be considered. I know we have to have other funding sources, and certainly the ad valorem tax and the sales tax would be either one or the other. I would live with, but I'm against the budget cuts. I really am. Our quality of life, as you said, that gentleman told you, is keeping kids away from Jacksonville. But, so we do need the money, and there are two good sources there, and it affects our citizens have gotten a break because our contributions to the fund haven't kept up. And so now we can no longer kick it down the road. We've got to address this and explain to the public how we got there and what it's going to be used for and what it means for our city. So that's
Okay, thank you. Others?
Chair.
Gwen? Ms. Yates?
I'm agreeing with you, especially on the general fund cuts. I would be willing to make a motion that we take that off the table and not even consider it. As a citizen of this community, I don't want our general funds cut. We already know what happens when those cuts kick in. We know what happens to our libraries. We know what happens to other city services. And so I don't think that should even be on the table. And if I get enough people to say yes, I'd be willing to.
There's a motion to take budget cuts as we know, in a general way, to fund the extra. I mean, the council may find other things.
Right.
But as it relates to this.
As it relates to this, I would say as citizens, we need to take this off the table.
Is there a second to that?
Second.
Sherry? Discussion on that motion. Greg?
Through the chair, what would your view be if we dedicated a small part of the millage that exists right now? In your mind, is that a budget cut? So let me say it just another way. So during the budget process, I proposed, you can't come in close.
Yeah.
I proposed a 25 basis point basically set aside. And it was early in the process, and it just didn't get any votes, but mine, you got my vote. And that would have generated about 10 or 11 million dollars. So I guess my question, Ms. Yates, would that, in your mind, be a budget cut?
If we did not have to suffer the loss of city services, then I would say we could consider that. But from what we just went through during the last budget process, I was not comfortable with that at all. And you're on the council now, and you know what's available, and I'm not privy to that. But I just want to make sure that when we start the discussion about city services, that it doesn't, that we don't lose any more. Right now, we say we want to cut to the bone. We're at the marrow now. We're past bone.
Yep.
So.
Okay. Bob?
No, we've said that we're going to start with $150 million that's already in there, so I would not be in favor of earmarking any more general revenue funds to go beyond that.
Other discussion? Y'all ready to vote on the motion? David? Yep.
Just on the way to understand, so the 150 that's there today, how do we think of the chapter funds? That's a 150 that's required as the payment, assuming something. And the assumption is that there's 4.5 or there's 9 million that's helping that 150 to be achieved. Is it 0, 4.5, or 9?
Wait a minute, though. That's a different, unless I'm not understanding, because her motion is that we take budget cuts off the table.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So that's the motion before us. So all budget cuts other than, specifically designed to remedy this.
Right.
Right. Okay, are y'all ready to vote on that? All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Anybody voting no? Greg is voting no.
I abstain.
And David is abstaining. Got that, Carol? Okay, so we've taken that off. So now let's continue our discussion. And you don't have to talk through the chair. This is a committee of the whole. Well, no, I'm not, anyway. Where do we go from here? Anybody want to propose one or more sources? I thought on the way over here that we could dedicate $1,000 a year out of the city budget to buy the Powerball. So, Carl?
I know the fire rescue surtax is a complicated thing to get done, but I like the idea if we're going to name a source and it's going to pay things related to police and fire, that it come from that sort of that side of the house, so to speak. I don't know how we get that done. You might go through that again. Sure. As to how that works, but.
Well, let me do it this way. Do you want to make a motion that we look to the sales tax, surtax as a source, as a source, I'll put it that way.
Well, it'll be a very weak motion, but I'll make it, but I'm not
All right, that's seconded.
I'm not committed to it.
All right, that's seconded by Ms. Strickland. Okay. What the statute says, and Cindy's here too, so she can correct me if I'm wrong, is that that cities who qualify, and we're advised that we qualify, although Cindy's in the process of writing an opinion, what the qualification is that if you have already adopted 2 of these surtaxes, there are about 9 of them, that do not have an expiration date, you're ineligible. But we've only got one as we view it, and that's the Better Jacksonville plan has an expiration date, and the JTA sales tax, does not. So we qualify. So that being said, then the sales tax surtax also requires a referendum of the people. It also requires that any revenues received in the next budget year offset the general fund budget, which would, I guess, mean the ad valorem part of the budget, by the amount of the revenues that you receive. So that sales tax revenues are year to year. So presumably the sales tax would, if the voters approved it, would go into effect January 1 of 2015. So we would not receive that money until the first quarter of 2016. And during that budget year, which is the 2015-16 budget year, we would have to offset that amount in the ad valorem budget. So let's just say, for round numbers, that's $60 million. When it comes around, the 2015-16 budget would have to be reduced by that amount. And this can only be used for fire and rescue services and facilities. So that would mean that in order not to have it just be a wash, what we would need to do would be to ask the city council to pass an ad valorem millage increase, roughly equivalent to what we think the sales tax would produce. That would presumably be this budget year, and that would then go into effect in the budget year beginning October 1st of 2014. Then the council at the same time would put on the ballot a referendum, thinking August, but it doesn't have to be August. Well, let me back up. Before you can put it on the ballot, you have to have reached an agreement with the majority of the other communities that are the subject of who receive fire and rescue services, which presumably would be the four, Baldwin, and the Beaches. They have to agree to this. A majority of them have to agree to this. So, assuming they do, a referendum would go on the ballot, and you could put it to the citizens. Would you rather have an ad valorem tax increase to pay for this, or would you rather have a sales tax to pay for it? So in a sense, you're giving the citizens the decision ultimately, so that, I mean, the city council has acted responsibly by saying, here's the number, here are the revenue sources. So the citizens would then vote. If they voted to deny the sales tax, then the council would have already increased the millage rate, so you just chug along with whatever that was. If the sales tax is approved, then the citizens have voted, yes, we think it's better to do the sales tax, which would mean then you'd come around the following year, you'd have 1 year in there where you'd have the millage increase. And you would automatically reduce it. So the citizens should not be fearful that the council would go back on there and try to keep that extra millage, because they couldn't do that because the statute requires that that be automatically reduced. That's the way I see the process. Cindy, did I leave anything out?
Just one clarification, because the council would have...
Can you talk right into the mic?
Just one clarification. Because the council would have advance increased the ad valorem, the council would be entitled to leave the ad valorem in place.
The statute requires a reduction.
Only if the sales tax is approved.
Correct.
So you have to net, but if you don't approve the sales tax...
That's what I said,
the
right.
council can keep the tax
That's right.
increase or not in
That's
place.
right. And that's a good point. One of the attractions of the sales tax, if it's voted in, is that it's in. And so we weren't worried about, on the ad valorem tax, being able to bind future councils down the road. This has the additional advantage of it's there for whatever fixed period you want. You could do it out to whatever year you estimate the 80% is going to be done, or you could go a little bit beyond that. But that's the idea. Bob?
You know, I would certainly favor the sales tax, and it's for the reason that all of the counties that are around us benefit from what happens in Jacksonville. They come here to work and to buy and whatever. Although it sounds like it's a pretty convoluted process to make that happen, and if they have to agree, they would rather have us tax our own people than.
Well, they wouldn't agree because it'd only be the people in Duval County. It wouldn't be St. Johns County, I think. They wouldn't, Cindy, they wouldn't be part of the interlocal because they wouldn't be participating in the ad valorem that we do.
No, I thought you said that the surrounding counties had to approve an increase.
No,
in
just
sales tax.
just the Three Beaches community in Baldwin that are in Duval County.
Oh, okay. I'm
Which is,
misunderstood.
through the chair, which is significant. We have a very complex relationship with them when it comes to taxation.
Yes.
So just to,
And we also have the council president being part of one of them.
we do.
Right, okay. Charlie? Charlie?
Biggest question I have, I would prefer the surtax also for all the reasons stated, mostly because surrounding communities benefit from a safety standpoint in everything we do here. And I guess it would be the same concern regardless. The way this thing was, the way we discussed this, and whether it's 195 or 200, we haven't decided that yet. But we're talking $45 to $50 million. And the surtax could certainly, I would think, if the referendum could say we're going to have this surtax, which is going to be dedicated to funding the police and fire pension fund until it reaches 80%, as an example. So what happens at that point? We get to 80%, the surtax goes away, and the ad valorem tax is what was offset. Is the ad valorem tax rate reduced, or does it automatically come back into effect if we drop off the surtax?
I don't think it comes back into effect, but Cindy may, but you just have to offset it by the revenues, so maybe it does stay in.
Right, there's never an automatic when it comes to ad valorem. The council each year has to consider and vote in the appropriate ad valorem. So if the sales tax, if you put, let's say you put it was going to retire in 2033, the council would have to fill that gap to pay police and fire if necessary, if other expenses such as pension expenses and all haven't decreased. Every year, they're obligated to look at the budget as a whole and to raise sufficient ad valorem to pay its outstanding obligations.
But, Charlie, just think that through though, but as I listen to that, you're only doing it to pay for the unfunded liability. You've reached the 80%, so you don't need it because you've included the normal cost in the normal budget anyway. That's not going to change.
Yep, but my question is, though, are they tied together? We could certainly say that the surtax will only be imposed until we reach 80% fund. I said that.
You'd have to be a specific year, I think, but, right.
But we have to have raised taxes in order to have them offset by the surtax.
But those taxes then go down.
Do they?
Right.
That's my question. When the
That's right.
surtax goes away, the taxes automatically go back down.
They don't go back up down the road, but
No.
you don't need them to go back up because that's all part of the normal cost that's in the $148 million.
In the interim, Mr. Chairman, in the interim, the ad valorem sales tax is going to go up and down as needed in the sole judgment of the 19 council members.
Okay.
Kirsty?
I thought that I had read somewhere that there had been an issue on collections, or the ability to collect on these types of payments. I'm assuming that if there was, it would be at a de minimis level.
Yes, it would be de minimis. What you might have heard is the precipitous drop in receipts that caused a surprise to bondholders to whom the sales tax had been pledged. But the collection is done very well by the state of Florida.
Bill?
So basically, with the sales tax, the millage rate would have to come in there for a year to cover
Right.
that. And then if the sales tax, because of its complexity, doesn't get ultimately passed, the opportunity of leaving the millage rate would be there.
Yeah, the millage rate would have been increased, but as Cindy was saying, the council would have to
Yes.
vote every year on the millage
That's
rate, and
correct.
that's their prerogative.
Yes.
Right.
Question?
Yes, Carl?
Okay. This is specifically says fire and rescue surtax. So does it play over into police or
No.
to pensions, or
No.
how do we make that work?
It has to go for fire and rescue services. So what you would do, Greg, as the chairman of the finance committee, is that portion of the fire rescue budget that's in the ad valorem would be shifted over and be funded by the sales tax. We couldn't really say legally that this is funding the pensions. That's going to come out of the ad valorem budget. It's just, as Cindy has said before, dollars are fungible. So you just, technically, they're going to pay for fire and rescue services. And you're going to use the money that's freed up to pay the pensions. We think that's legal. Is that legal?
Is that, the council certainly has, the council will end up with the ultimate power to raise and lower taxes. We'll have to take the half-cent sales tax and apply it to fire and rescue. It's likely to be inadequate for the expenses of fire and rescue in any event, so they'll supplement with their ad valorem. But those are the tools that they look at every year. In terms of sales tax funding is part of the budget, ad valorem is part of the budget, grant money, all of that. And often you have restricted funds, so you spend those in a restricted manner and then look at your unrestricted funds and pay the rest.
So the answer, I think, is yes, that it is illegal to do this, because it's like, I remember when they used to say you ought to designate your gift to the United Way. And people would do that, but then they'd say, well, the United Way is going to offset it anyway, so why would I do that? So then why not just give it generally? And that's the way I've always done. So it's a matter of dollars being fungible, you can do it. Okay, other conversation.
So ad valorem is $1.5 million. I mean, is that the way of thinking about that?
I think we're at one.
Well, but.
Oh, you mean?
That's where I was thinking of the equation of the sales tax at 68.
Right, if you,
And a
yes.
mill is 44 or so, basically.
Right, you'd be asking, we'd have to get the numbers, but at 44 to 68, that'd be about $1.5 million. That's right. Yep, goes up and goes down, right. Bob and then Carl.
So to the extent we did a half-cent on the surtax, that might also free up some money for the general pension fund in terms of if it produces 68 and we only need 50.
That's right. That's right. I saw Carl. Did anybody else? Yes, Carl?
The question would be too, in terms of inflation on the 68, sales, general sales tend to go up year after year. So is there a way to get an estimate on what that might mean?
Through the chair, we can provide you with the trend on the sales tax. It does go down. It went down in 1997. It went down again in the early 2000s. It certainly went down during the recession. So while it tends to have overall higher growth because of the constitutional constraints on ad valorem growth, it does go up and down, and it still is going to require an annual look by the city council.
And would this fund have the, I assume there are some things that are not covered under the tax. Would it have the same?
The application, you mean
for food, say?
And tax exempt, it's the same rules. Yes, I don't recall any specific exceptions to this half cent. Sometimes the half cents are more limited, but I don't recall any for this one.
You've raised a good point, because every year, even though let's say the sales tax is passed, that's used for fire rescue. Every year, we can't designate that for the pensions. So that means every year we have to keep the community pressure up to say, council, you can't reduce the ad valorem taxes to get rid of this pension payment. Because the pension payment, remember, is still coming from the ad valorem. So and Cindy is telling us that we can't bind future councils, so we need to have the community will to force them to keep doing this.
Like, not when it comes to ad valorem, that's purely the council's power.
The special master would,
No.
Harvey would have to exercise all of his humor and maybe we could get Judge Howard, Judge Wallace, and Judge Schlesinger to be the masters. So
I don't think the federal government wants to work for us.
Okay, so anyway, further discussion on this. David, I'm sorry I missed you.
Just for form, the question would be, when we talk about the $200 million, how how is chapter, what's the assumption being made on chapter funds?
Chapter funds are not a part of that yet. We can make a recommendation that we,
So for instance, the revised MSP, I think, does make an assumption that chapter funds go to that. So
Right.
the question is how they modeled, you know,
they're not modeled in this except for the, well, maybe that they are. David, how are they, because he proposed 2 million, 2 million, 2 million, and 4 million, as I recall, something like
The
that.
existing usage of chapter funds that are are part of current reductions in the normal cost for the plan are modeled in. No changes from current policy right now on use of chapter funds are modeled in any of this.
Okay, so
So
help
in
me
two- so in-
re-understand the chapter funds. There's about 4.5 million that are being used, and there's another 4.5 million available, is that right?
well, so if we get beyond the period where there was some deals cut on balances, right? So in 2020, when you model a contribution requirement, that's the total required for the city and employees, but then the employees has been excluded from that. And so are there any chapter funds that are going to meet obligations in 2020 in looking at those payments?
Yeah, so the current usage of, I believe it's 4.15% of
Okay.
payroll
Right.
continues to be built in.
So the 200 million only works if we recognize we're also continuing to require the $4.5 million to be part of that, part of
Yes.
the total funding. Okay.
So that would mean,
So the additional chapter funds,
in addition to the 50 million roughly that we'd be putting in.
right,
So the additional chapter funds discussed in the city's proposal are in the city plan version, but are in no other aspects of this modeling.
So David, help me then understand. Let's say we got the 200 million. You got 148 million from the city budget. Then do you have 4.1 million in chapter funds?
You would have 148 million from the city budget, 50 million from source to be determined.
Right.
And then, it's about 4.15% of payroll estimated going into.
So that's 204 million rather than 200 million.
I'm
in
not
the
sure the
aggregate.
exact number.
But roughly.
Something on the order of, I
Is
think.
that your question, David?
And this is the current allocation of how chapter funds are handled.
All right. So if we reduce to 195, that still puts us at the aggregate 200.
It's 200 plus that 5 million, so it's 205 million going in.
All right.
200 from, the various sources, and then 5 million from the chapter funds.
Okay. I don't think we understood that, right?
So-
Okay, we've postponed that discussion. I just want to make that clear, so.
But is there another 5 million potential chapter funds?
I think that the answer is yes, I'm not
Yes,
positive. Right. So it's
which
a total
we
of
didn't-
about $10 million.
in the short run. And I actually think it's helpful to think of that as a way to fund the normal cost. And so that, so if you want 4% of that, as we did in our charts, if you want that number is the dollar amount of 4% of the payroll is gonna go up every year. So the 4.5 million today may be 4%, but in 10 years, it may take 7.5 million to make 4%. So it seems to me, the sense of it would be, chapter funds go first to cover 4% of the normal cost, because that's a sharing of cost among the constituents. And then, to the extent there's funds available in the short run until we get 80% funded, it could be it's $5 million, it could be it's $1 million, it could be it's zero. That secondary residual goes towards the underfunded liability. But we probably wouldn't count on that as being much money for purposes of meeting our funding
Okay.
shortfall, especially if we can't fund for a whole year.
So that would mean Greg could use that in his 148.
Right.
Okay. All right, Greg?
Thank you. And after all that discussion, I don't think I'm confused, but I want to make sure I'm not confused. So the mayor's plan included $40 million from JEA and essentially $5 million in chapter funds, and you've modeled that. Is that correct?
So the mayor's plan, and maybe getting the numbers slightly wrong, $40 million from JAA, about $5 million in chapter funds that are already occurring, already baked in, and then an additional the additional remainder of the chapter funds that are currently going
That's
into
the
the
way
enhanced
I thought.
development account.
Okay, thank you.
For the 200 million includes that first 5 million or so in chapter funds or 6 million or so in chapter funds going in to help pay costs, but leaves the remaining 5 or 6 million going into the enhanced benefit account.
So David, another way to put it, the 148 million already includes 5 million in chapter funds.
Okay.
That's what he said?
That's,
Is that right? That's right. The current 148 contributions.
So the 148 million was employer costs, or employer contributions. In addition to that, about 5 million went into the system from
In
those,
addition
in
to-
addition to that.
Okay.
okay. So that would, that's really 153 million. I was thinking of 2 million. Okay.
But then there's another 5 million.
Then there's
Potentially
another 5
available.
million. Right. So we could recommend that we put in 190 and recommend the 5 million continue and the 5 million, the additional 5 million from chapter
Yeah.
funds.
The full amount of chapter funds be dedicated to retiring the unfunded liability until 80% funded.
Till 80% funded.
I mean, do we know what those dollars are currently, what their current use is?
I think Mr. Keene could tell us, but I think that what they do is every year in December, they vote to have a cash distribution. Is that right?
4% is pledged to the base benefit fund for some of these benefits our members currently are receiving.
Now, what does that mean to my, I mean, that's part of the normal cost?
When the city council enacted some pension benefit increases to help offset the cost, our members voted and pledged part of the 175 and 185 money.
Okay.
So some of these benefits y'all talk about taking away from them, they're paying for it. So when you think you're gonna take them away, you wouldn't want them to keep paying for something they're not gonna get. But that's another bridge to cross down the line.
Right.
But in further an answer to your question, 4 million goes in. We use another $1.5 million for a post-retirement enhancement for our senior retired people, and the rest are maintained in a reserve account.
In a reserve account, okay. That's the reserve account that was in the original proposal?
That is.
Okay, right. Does that answer your question?
And that's also the reserve account Mayor Brown was talking about, taking 5 million and 7 million and 7 million and 5 million,
Right.
or whatever those numbers were,
Right.
over a period of years.
Okay.
But are those, I mean, what are the funds benchmarks on the reserve that you have to maintain? And what percentage of that pot of money is used to maintain that reserve?
Well, we're always going to pull out about $2 million to support the post-retirement enhancement.
That's the December thing, right?
December.
Other than that, it goes into the reserve. Right. Okay, I'm sort of a little bit lost on where we are at the moment.
Well,
We're,
it sounds like we still have to raise $45 million.
Yeah.
right, that's right. And we have a motion that we go to the sales tax to do that. And I'm
What was the
thinking,
motion?
a half-cent sales tax, is that right?
But
The
Bill,
motion was coerced into making. Was that we consider the fire rescue surtax, which is what all this discussion.
So as the first priority as opposed to ongoing.
I'm taking that as the first priority.
but it's still revenue neutral, right?
Revenue neutral.
Well, you gotta reduce the millage rate to get
Yeah.
there.
Right. So as part of this
So
motion,
the political part of this is you gotta raise the ad valorem, raise the sales tax, get the voters
Right.
agree.
that's right. So I would
And
think
then
that would
it's
all
not
be part of
revenue.
it.
So
Right.
it's very complicated to
Right.
get to the 45 million using the sales tax.
But it gives the public the choice between the ad valorem and the surtax.
Or less. You still have to raise you have
Yeah.
to raise the millage
Yeah.
rate first.
Yeah, that's right.
And if they
I know that.
choose, they can lower it back down by voting for the surtax.
Right.
But you
Charlie?
still have to raise the
Yeah.
millage
Really?
rate first.
Yeah, and, I mean, and I agree with
Get
that.
away from the millage rate.
I think the point, to me, how you get there is we recommend that the city council raise the millage rate. And subsequent to that, they put out the referendum to then convert that over to the fire rescue surtax. I think they have to pass the ad valorem increase first, but then it becomes a vote of the citizens to convert that over to sales tax. But in any event, there will be the $45 million.
You wouldn't be converting it, because you've got to raise the $45 million.
You take it back down.
Yeah, if it passes,
It automatically
then
comes
you
down.
can take it back down, if it passes.
Right.
Is it $1.5 million or $1 million?
Well, that's the next point. Carl, in your I think that process is what was envisioned by your motion. The process of the millage rate increase, the sales tax, and as I understood it, that's all part of it. Does everybody understand where we are?
Yes.
All right, Greg didn't look like he did. Are you?
Sort of. I guess we're in the discussion phase, and what I'm afraid to do at this point is to move forward without at least having some discussion about the merits of other options.
They're on the
And we've
floor.
not done
Right.
that yet, and so that's really what I
That's
wanted.
because y'all have been silent.
Well-
So you now have your opportunity.
Well, the franchise fee is brought up, I'm just going through the list here, and, it's just,
Yep.
and I know the paper had an article about the franchise fee, and it said.
Talking to the mic.
It said we could raise $40 million, and that could be done by going from 3% to 6%. And the cost, I think the article says about $3 for every, is that $100 for the bill? So if it's a $300 bill you get, it'd be $9 a month. And I just think we ought to at least discuss that. If you were going to replace something with the sales tax, that might be a little cleaner, a little simpler, is what I was thinking.
Does that require a supermajority vote?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Which means what? 16, 2/3, which would be, what, 15
A
of
lot of
9?
people.
A lot of people. Okay.
What's that first one?
Gwen?
As opposed to the sales tax, so that franchise fee would only be coming from the customers of JEA, right?
That's right.
Instead of the entire sales tax base.
I'm not speaking pro or con. I'm just trying to think of the different options. What I think the proposal was is to replace this with a sales tax. And so the question is, what's the best interim way to get there? And we had talked about sort of this convoluted, we're going to raise the ad valorem, but then there's all these problems with it. And I wondered if the franchise fee is just a cleaner way to do it if you're trying to replace it with a sales tax.
Right. Okay, so any, Cindy?
The franchise fee, because it's already been imposed with an agreement with JEA, one has to ensure that it's still considered a fee and not a tax. So there are legal issues that accompany the increase in the franchise fee.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow that.
The county can only charge fees for services, and the fee has to kind of equate to what the value's given. And if not, it's considered a tax even if you call it a fee. And so we have an agreement with JEA that you can be in our right-of-way for 3%. So I have to look at that contract and see if we now change the contract and say now it costs you 6%, whether that would be considered really a tax and not a fee for the use of our right-of-way.
Okay.
So I just raise each issue. There's no easy comparison.
Okay.
I'm also just wondering, both of these, I love the principle and the idea behind the surtax, but it also just seems that given the history with the way we've managed our millage rate and the disparity that we have, and the fact that that's a much more simple area or way to resolve it, to generate revenue, I'm wondering why we're, as a committee, why we're being so silent about that, other than the political reason.
No, it's not silent. It's just that was the first thing up. Would you like to speak some more about it? Or anybody else want to speak more about the?
Yeah, I mean, that's
Yeah.
why I asked for that data. I think that there is a a large drive that misconstrues the reality of our property tax. And we need data to be able to rebut that and to contextualize it for the community. I did find in my binder one of the earlier handouts that shows what we've done with the millage since 2000, or at least from 2000 until 2012. And at 2012, we were still at a rate that was lower than the 2000 millage. I mean, at some point, I think that we just have to be reasonable and practical about the millage, and I think a good way to do that is to assess it with objective criteria, which is what are comparable communities doing?
So, Joel, that is to say we need what the millage rates are on the comparable committees. We don't care about the dollars. We need to know what the millage rates are.
And Bill, I found the JCCI study. It's dated, but it compares us to Orlando and Orange, Tampa, Hillsborough, St. Petersburg, Pinellas, Miami-Dade, and Jacksonville, Duval, and it combines the city and county tax. Again, it's dated, and we're, a good 2 mils below Orlando, which at that time was the closest to us.
Even at 11.5%?
And that includes all their special taxing districts. So it's all in. I don't accept the fact the city can't do this. Comparison, call JCCI, they can do it.
Okay.
This was in our binder. It's
Yeah.
the...
It's the JCCI report.
Yeah,
in
it
the
was...
fall.
Well, it's so dated, it's hard, huh?
What does it show ours, though?
Well, our
Does it reflect the last increase?
yeah, if you all in, including the school district, would be 16.49. Orange was 18. Tampa Hillsborough was 21.7. St. Petersburg Pinellas 24.1. Miami-Dade was 22.6. So I don't see why we can't run it, update it and look at, and it's all in. So it's schools and their special taxing districts.
Okay, that's 2009 is the data.
Yeah, that was their report.
Right.
It's in the binder.
Yep. It's actually the first document in the binder. So, okay. Bob?
Bill, it just seems to me like no matter what we do, if we use the police and fire surtax, then that offsets their cost and brings more money into the general revenue fund. Seems like no matter what we do, money ends up in the general revenue fund, and that's subject to manipulation. Just we're looking at the history of that right now. So I don't know, we can't bind the council to anything. I just don't know. We're sitting here debating where the money comes from, and I don't know if that really makes any difference. In the end, we have to have the political will to actually retire the unfunded liability.
Yep. Joey?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I may, just to address Ms. McGill's point, it is relatively dated. If you just look at, I just pulled that up on my iPad too. I went to the retirement reform website. The 8.48 mils that is listed for the city county operations for Jacksonville, that's now 3 mils higher, 11.4. So if you add that in, not knowing what has changed in Orlando and Tampa and St. Petersburg, we are no longer the lowest. We are now above Orlando. I will, over the next week, do my best to update this. What's going to be challenging, like I said earlier, is making it apples to apples. In that city-county operations line, Ms. McGill, you're looking at it, I'm going to have to go back and recreate this stale data to find out what they were and were not including, and then I can try to update it for now. But, just on the, looking at the stale data, if you update for our tax increases that have gone through over the last year, 15% in ad valorem taxes last year, you may see a different picture.
Yeah, but you can't make the assumption they didn't raise their taxes.
Right.
No, you can't.
So we do need that data on there. Okay. Yep. All right, Joey, I'll call you every day till you get it. Okay. Gwen? Yeah.
Well, I'm just still thinking of the conversations that we've had on the table here. I still like the idea of the citizens being involved in the solution as well, and giving them an opportunity to vote on what happened to the city. We started out this thing saying that everybody has to contribute or do something, and I think if it is explained to the community what is necessary and put to a vote that it would be fairer across the board. I just.
Okay, thank you. Others? Are y'all ready to vote on this? I'll say the first preference, first priority to follow this process, which we raise the ad valorem tax, do the sales tax, come back. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't also say that failing that, the ad valorem tax ought to be increased.
Mr. Chairman, did we decide that the franchise fee was substitutable
Oh,
or
I'm
not?
sorry. I haven't heard anything about that, so does anybody want to?
I was thinking that was prescribed. In other words, you had to do ad valorem to do the
Right.
sales. So
Right.
if that's not substitutable, then
It
really
is,
isn't an
somebody wants to
option.
make a motion that we do that instead. I mean, it seems to me you could substitute that as part of the city's, as part of the $148 million. They could do that separately.
way.
Right, so they could always go back and increase the franchise fees. So, you get that? Understand that?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, without confusing the public too much, should we consider a lesser percentage franchise fee, say 1% or whatever, in addition to the fire rescue surtax, lower it? I don't know how you lower a half cent. I don't think you can go a quarter cent.
Yeah, it seems to me the ease of it is the half cent, right?
Yeah. I'm
And I
just,
think the answer is the council can always go back and do the franchise fee if they want.
yeah, okay. But that doesn't help
Yep.
solve our part of the problem.
I don't think so. Right. Greg, and then I think Charlie's got a queerless eye, so we'll go back to you.
The other thing that I'd like to at least have some discussion in is timing. We're running into a budget cycle here pretty soon, so if we were going to do the sales tax replacement, which I think I agree completely, we need to let the voters decide. You're exactly right. The timing associated, that's probably a year plus out. And so I just want to make sure that, and in terms of raising ad valorem, that's only going to happen at budget time, right?
Right. I'm not seeing it as a year out. I'm seeing it, if we get this done, we have to negotiate. I mean, there are intricacies of the statute, but I don't see any reason that we couldn't put this on the ballot. Actually, in November, because since it's an automatic offset, if you guys and gals increase the ad valorem millage rate by that amount and then put it on the ballot, you've accomplished the same thing because it doesn't go into effect until the 2015-16 ballot year, budget year, tax year. Right. No, the sales tax. Yeah. Right. So if you increase it in the budget year,
But what would we use to balance the budget?
ad valorem, you'd increase it by the mill, and then because that's going to happen that year anyway, regardless, you're still going to get 1 mill increase for 1 year. And then you'd put on the ballot the half cent, and that'd go around, and if it failed, then you would have already increased by what you needed. And if it passed, then the following year it would offset. It would.
But you can't completely offset, right? Because you can't get to the 45 million. What am I missing about this?
With the 1 mil?
Yeah.
Right, you're right.
No, you would increase the millage rate to equate to 1/2 cent.
Oh, okay, so then it's more than 1 mil.
Right.
Okay.
Right. That's right.
And then you reduce it a mil.
Right, exactly. But you reduce it by what the equivalent amount. Right. Charlie?
I guess back to Greg's comment and what I said earlier, to me, this has to be a package deal. And so I think we're probably a year away, unless things move a lot quicker than I would think. I would not be in favor of recommending a millage increase until and unless we have the agreement of the police and fire pension fund.
Sure.
To me, that's a condition precedent. It's the whole concept of shared sacrifice for this. And so we don't need to rush into the millage increase until we know we got the deal.
Right.
Because it's a quid pro quo, and I would hate to see us raise the millage rate and then can't get the rest of it done. Yes.
Right. We've already said that it's part of the, it's a package. Right. Don, did you want to say something? Oh, I thought you were saying. Okay. Are y'all ready to vote on this?
Okay, what's the motion?
The motion, as I understand it, is that we vote to recommend to the city, in our report, as part of the whole report, and conditioned upon all of it, that we recommend an increase in the sales tax. Well, first of all, that we follow the procedure for implementing a sales tax increase of 0.5 cent, and that would include the council passing a resolution to increase the millage rate by the equivalent of 0.5 cent sales tax, that they call for a referendum to be placed on the ballot. We don't want to say as soon as possible because that might be August. Put it on the ballot in a timely fashion, so that the people will have an ability to consider whether they would like to have whether they would prefer a sales tax increase as contrasted with the equivalent ad valorem tax increase. That's the way I understand. And then the implementation of that would come through Cindy's office, and the council would have to, the ordinance would have to be carried up. That's the essence of your motion. Did I get it right?
Close.
Close? Okay. Good.
Should it, you referenced sales tax 2 or 3 times, should we not include the terminology fire rescue
Yes.
surtax, because that's what it is?
That's what it is.
Instead
Absolutely.
of sales tax, fire rescue surtax to be collected through the,
Through section
Sales.
212 of
Through the
55.
sales.
Right. Okay.
so that,
Yep.
I think the public would like to know that their money is going specifically for fire rescue.
Sure.
Or
I've always heard
police.
that you guys and the journalists were very precise.
Yeah, right.
Bill?
That also then includes Charlie's comments about this is all part of a large package.
Deal. Yes, it does. Right. Ready to vote on that?
Yes.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Greg is voting no. Okay. So let's go, let's say, is there a, carrying on, suppose, well, we've done that, so the ad valorem tax would continue. Okay, all right, okay. So is there anything else we need to do on sources? Yes, and let me just say, we need to encourage the city to continue to find lazy assets that they could dispose of in the process we already voted on, so that those monies could be used to go to the payment of that would be the payment of the ARC. I mean, of their portion of the 148. So, is that what, I think that's what you were getting around to saying, maybe not.
No, separate from the point of the lazy assets, I think is just clarification around how we want to leave the expectations around the chapter funds.
Okay, let's take that up.
And we can do that next time
Let's
if
do-
you'd rather do that next time.
Let's do that. On the real estate, that's what we said before, and that would go into the report. Kirsten?
I wanted just to close the loop on the last motion, which is I think there needs to be a recommendation that in the event, however unlikely, that the referendum does not pass, that the city council continue with the increased ad valorem at the rate required to make the
Yes.
payment.
That's the new, second motion. I'm seeing Bill second it. Any discussion?
The idea, person, is that we're not going to cut any more city services.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, okay. And I think, Greg, are you voting? For that, okay. All right, thank you for being here, okay. So now let's talk about the chapter funds. David?
So on the chapter, and we maybe can do this next week when we're looking at the additional changes to plan design, but I think it's helpful for purposes of understanding what we signed up for to know what portion of the day-to-day run rate of the normal costs are going to be paid by the chapter funds. So today, $4.5 million might be 4%. In 15 years, when we're 60% funded, it may take very well $7 or $8 million to cover a 4% talk. So we're either, I like the idea of dedicating a 4% part of the total benefit cost to be funded by chapter funds to the extent those are available, or to the extent additional premium taxes come up and more become available, and then the residual go to fund the unfunded liability till 80% funded.
And is that on the first 4.5 or the second 4.5? or all of it?
Of the $9 million that exists today, I would suggest that the way we're leaving chapter funds is the 4% of the normal cost is paid out of the $9 million first.
Okay.
To the extent the residual funds are available, they'd be dedicated until we're 80% funded towards the paying the unfunded liability. And then that falls away if there's a residual still left. Yeah.
Is there a second to that motion?
No,
Well, other people can.
I know.
Right, okay.
I thought you were asking
No,
me.
no, no, okay. Charlie, is that a second? Second. Is there discussion? Let me, just for clarification, are you including within that they would have to discontinue their practice in December of giving that? Because I think people may have come to depend on that. Those are the retirees. So would you exclude that? Whatever that amount is. I'm just asking.
Yeah,
Is that-
no, it's a good question. And
Yeah.
as a dollar amount or as a?
John's over there gritting his teeth, but how much, is that a dollar amount or is that a percentage amount?
It's a dollar amount.
It's a dollar amount. What's that dollar amount?
It's just under $2 million.
So say up to $2 million?
So of the $9
With
million.
with a COLA?
So the $9 million includes the two?
9 million,
Yeah.
the 9 million includes the two.
So the funds would be allocated, first $2 million as off the top goes towards funding existing and continuous benefits.
As they are currently done in December of each year.
Right. The next 4% of normal cost is
Right.
funded out of the $9 million, and then there's residual after that, it goes to funding the unfunded liability.
Okay. All right, that's the motion. Charlie, is that okay with you? Okay. Now, Kirsten.
I understand, and I don't necessarily disagree with the principle. My concern, though, is that, the way I've looked at the chapter funds is in halves, and I understand that there's one pot of 4.5 and there's another pot of 4.5. My concern about using both pots of the 4.5 is that there are good and reasonable uses for those monies that people are relying on, including but not limited to the payout to the retirees. And my understanding, at least within JFRD, is that they're looking at a lot of retirees in the next 2 or 3 years, just based on hiring trends and where they are with drop. So my concern is that once we start spending that second pot, or that second 4.5, even if we use it, even if we say limit it to a dollar amount, that dollar amount isn't necessarily going to stay static. I think it's going to change depending on the pool of retirees. And I also worry that the reserve, if we're using that second pot for the reserve to maintain the reserve, I don't think it's proper from any sort of fund scenario to take dollars out from, a pot of money that's going to be used to keep its reserve at a certain ratio or level.
Okay, thank you. Other comments? Bob?
Yeah, I would concur with that. I would not be in favor of using the second 4.5% or following the mayor's proposal to use the reserve. I would favor keeping hands off of both of those.
Okay, other comments? You all ready to vote? Now, the motion is to use all of it. The first priority would be the $2 million for I'll call them the December benefits. The next part goes to fund the normal cost contribution of 4%. And if the next part goes to fund the unfunded liability until it's reaches 80%. Did I say that right? Okay. Y'all ready to vote? All in favor say aye. Aye. Let's raise our hands. 1, 2, all against. 1, 2, 3, all against. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 against, okay? It's not a substitute. You may offer another one. I don't think the 1-year rule applies to this committee.
So the $2 million goes out first, the 4% goes out second, and then any residual is unavailable to meet other benefit requirements.
Is there a second?
So we're either hard coding $4.5 million is the question, or we're hard coding 4%. And if we're not hard coding 4%, then we just have to recognize we're offering a more generous benefit payment not paid for by employees.
Okay.
Just to clarify, already 4.15% of payroll is going from chapter funds to employee benefits.
Right, so you're assuming already 4% gets covered somewhere, not 4.5 million, right?
Yeah, it's 5% of payroll. It's,
So-
which happens to be right now, whatever it is. But
So that being the case, do we need your motion?
Well, modeling the numbers is modeling the numbers, but the sense of the committee is.
Is that that
what it-
continues?
Is that, yeah,
All
so
right,
we're, as to what we're endorsing as a committee,
Okay.
if we adopt those numbers, we're endorsing that.
That
There's a 4, is that correct, David? There's a
It's-
4%.
it's in the agreement
normal
now,
cost.
and it's,
Okay.
I believe it's 4.1, first 4% goes to pay for base benefits. Then there's a small portion that's next that goes to the reserve account, or the enhanced benefit account, sorry. Then there's another portion that goes back to help pay for for the city's contributions, and then the remainder stays with the city. Possibly Joey can.
I'm really
Kirsten.
confused.
All right, let's get an analysis of this and
Sorry.
bring it back next week, as you suggested. So I think there's no motion, there is a motion on the table, and let's sort of, was it seconded?
Let me see if we can clear it up a little bit. We received last week a chart of normal costs, right? And Robert, you helped us work that out. And in that chart of normal costs, we assigned 4.1% to the estimated normal costs being covered by chapter funds. And so and I think that's the way the data has been modeled, unless you're taking exception to it, David.
No, it's been modeled that way.
And so all I'm trying to clarify is that we are, by signing up for this, we've asked that up to 4% of normal costs be paid for by chapter funds, not necessarily $4.5 million.
Okay, that's helpful. I appreciate that. This is my question. With the modeling that was done, were you using both pots of the 4.5? Using one?
This is the existing pot that's already going towards helping pay
Not the excess.
the cost of the plan.
I mean, I think the actuarial assumptions assume that payroll costs go up every year, right? So the $4.5 million is going to be a declining percentage over time,
But
or it's going to take more than $4.5 million to
The
get.
30-year agreement that allocates these is based as a percentage of pay. It's not based on fixed dollar amounts. So.
Right. So you're assuming there'll be more chapter funds and dollar amounts available as time goes on as a built-in assumption.
So help me understand, are we then moving to continue the present practice?
I think that's what I hear
Through-
the current motion doing.
Well, the present practice is $4.5 million, I think.
Present practice
But
is a
the
percent
model-
of payroll.
The model practice is 4%, right?
But no, this is also in the 30-year agreement, which
Oh,
is
it is?
the
Okay, I apologize.
existing
Okay, I've got it.
embodiment of that.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
what he said, okay.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So the motion is we continue the present practice with regard to the chapter funds. Is that your motion?
Yes.
Is there a second to that? Second. Any discussion? Charlie has that querulous look again. Okay, all in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Okay, thank you. Chris wants to say something.
I just wanted to point out that during the mediation settlement agreement, the Police and Fire Pension Fund agreed to use accumulated enhanced benefits money from the chapter funds, which at that time was $20 million, and now it's $24 million to help the city pay down its contribution. So I would just sort of suggest respectfully not to undo anything that's already agreed to or already has been agreed to, because they've agreed to put additional money toward the city's annual required contribution in those.
Okay, so that we could then entertain a motion as reflected by the mediated settlement agreement to apply the reserve fund roughly $20 million.
Well, now it's $24 million.
Huh?
Now it's
$24 million.
But it was 20 then.
20 then, correct.
That's what we committed, was 20, not
Gotcha, all right, so 20
Okay.
then.
All right,
is-
let's
now
don't
you
have a
asked what
debate
current
on the
amount
floor.
is.
Right.
The current
Okay.
amount is $24 million,
Right.
correct?
Okay, so would anybody like to make a motion with regard to that account? I heard Kirsten saying, well, not touch the reserve account, I think. So would anybody like to make a motion today that we do that? We can come back and look at that next week. Carl Cannon moves that and there's a second by John Wilbanks, that we take that we apply the current balance of the enhanced benefit reserve fund that was previously agreed to in the mediated settlement agreement, but the balance, not the number then, and apply that to the city's cost, and I'm taking that would be the 148 portion of it. That's the motion. Any discussion?
Is there a requirement on the reserve?
Is there a
Is
requirement?
there a minimum standard on the reserve fund?
I don't know the answer to that. Cindy, do you know? She's saying no, there is not.
So
Okay.
why do you feel it's necessary to do this?
I'm not making the motion. Does
No,
any-
I'm asking whoever
Right.
made the motion.
Carl?
Why are we feeling like it's necessary to do this?
I guess it's because they've already agreed to do up to 20 million of it, right?
Then we wouldn't have to do anything.
Well, I'll offer a
They're
reason why. I
agreed.
think the new employees are largely following the MSP agreement, right? And the change that's, a big portion of the change that's been made for existing employees is related to the COLA. So it's been tweaking the benefits on a structure that's already been created. We know the ability to create new funding from tax revenues is going to be delayed 12 months. And so keeping those funds in place towards that funding liability seems consistent with the overall.
Okay.
I'm just generally,
Basically asking, putting in our report, we're recommending that city council continue to follow all parts of the agreement. Why this?
Mr. Chairman,
right?
can I clarify?
Yeah, Chris, do that.
Sure, let me clarify. I guess what I'm suggesting is a general proposition that the task force not recommend we take a course other than we're currently agreed to take. In addition to that, during the mediation last year, the Police and Fire Pension Fund agreed to devote the then balance, $20 million, in the Enhanced Benefits Reserve Account to the city to help pay its pension costs. Again, I'm suggesting that we not reverse course from agreements that have already been made, even if they weren't implemented, in terms of the Police and Fire Pension Fund agreeing to contribute additional dollars to help the city pay its pension costs. I just don't think we want to backtrack at this
Right,
point.
and if we did that in the total context of this agreement, something might happen
Right,
as we go through it. But we ought not back up. Charlie?
I'm trying to make sure I understand. This is one-time dollars, the $20
Correct.
million.
That's right.
And I think our previous discussion, we agreed that the city should make 148, or I rounded it up to 150 in my own mind, of annual contribution. This $20 million would be in addition to the 148 or the 150.
I'm taking that would help them pay the part of the 150.
I mean, but see, they paid the 148 last year without the 20. And what we're really trying to do is to get ahead of the problem.
Okay.
And to me, that's what I wanted to make clear. To me, that 20 million should be an additional contribution to help us get to 80% funding, not otherwise reduce the city's
Quickly.
contribution.
Okay.
That'd be my opinion.
All right.
And by the way, 80% is probably not the end. I mean, honestly, that's our aim, but, you know, to be fully funded, so that's already been committed to. I don't see why we'd back up from it.
Okay. Kirsten?
Just for some accuracy, though, as a commission, task force, whatever, we voted to recommend the mediated settlement agreement. And then we voted to amend that mediated settlement agreement in, I think, two
Only
respects.
as to pension design.
As to pension
Right,
design in
right.
two respects.
Right.
There were a number of components to the mediated settlement agreement that went beyond pension design. I don't think it's necessary or appropriate that we parse out some as opposed to, that we choose some of the non-pension design components as part of our recommendation. I mean, they're still going to be negotiating, right? The big piece of our work is on pension design and paying off the liability. It seems to me when you start getting into us making a recommendation on how to spend their reserve, I think that's beyond our work. And I think that's for them at the
Keep in
bargaining
mind
table.
that the mayor's proposal provided for that in addition to the mediate. Remember, we're trying to get in addition to that.
Right.
Right. So anyway, I don't want to debate as the chair, but other questions, concerns? Are y'all ready to vote? We were voting on using the chapter funds. Now, we're voting to continue the current, no, we're not. We've already done that. We're voting to use I'll just say the $20 million in the chapter reserve account to apply to the unfunded liability in addition to what we've already done. Does that fairly state the motion?
As agreed to,
Yeah, in addition to the 148, right.
as previously agreed.
As previously agreed. and the 20 million, not the balance. Chris is coming up.
I just want to clarify what was previously agreed. That $20 million did not go to the unfunded liability. It went to kind of assist with the city's annual required contribution for a year. In the plan the mayor brought to this task force, what would have been now a higher amount, $24 million, was used to help the city over a several-year period. The idea of doing it was in these extraordinarily challenging fiscal times, the idea was to kind of help give the city some budget relief while still being able to pay the amount that needs to be paid.
So that, to pick up on David's point, that during that first year, we might have some ability to use this. So the chair doesn't really understand where at the 20 million, I heard that to apply to the unfunded liability. Is that what y'all, that's the motion as I understood it?
That's, which is different from what the agreement was.
Correct.
That's right, yes.
I think we ought to leave that issue alone, because they already have the agreement.
All right, so then, just because we don't want to think that we've abandoned that, so we need to concur that the portion of the mediated settlement agreement concerning chapter funds be continued. Is that a fair way to say it? That the portion of the mediated settlement agreement concerning chapter funds be continued. And whoever moved it and seconded, I'm thinking that y'all have agreed to that. Okay. Now, David, do you want to say anything to that? Okay. So, are y'all ready to vote on that? All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed. Okay, that's Bob.
Yeah.
You're opposed. I'm opposed. Okay, Bob's opposed. Okay, so is there anything else that y'all would like to do on the? Well, not that you would like to do, that you feel a responsibility to do. Well, we need to come back to the number now before we leave, because we postponed that till now. So I think the motion was that the number be $200 million. So we're back to that motion. And is there any further discussion about that?
No, and then David Drain came back
Oh,
and
with
ran the
the range.
numbers and said 200 would support the goal.
Right.
And he did,
I don't think it wasn't. So let's, David?
Oh, I just wanted to agree, yes.
Right.
200 in city contributions
All right.
would be sufficient, to meet the goals stated of it being able to have stable contributions and a stable dollar amount, even in a situation where there's 5.4% returns on a consistent basis.
So the chair's going to make a decision that the motion is the 200 million. If y'all want to disagree with the chair, someone could make a motion to overrule the chair. And that will not hurt my feelings if you do. But okay, so we're voting on the $200 million contribution from the city annually until the unfunded liability reaches 80%. Is that right? Okay. Any further? Unfunded liability.
The funded ratio.
The funded ratio. The funded ratio. Right. The funded ratio reaches 80%. Okay. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed. I believe that's unanimous. Greg has left, though, Carol, and you'll need to reflect that. Okay. So, is there anything else we need to do on unfunded liability or sources? It's 4:15. I want to let y'all go, but I want to get the governance stuff. David, yes, John?
Did we agree on the JEA as not being even considered at this point?
Did we do what now?
With that?
We did what?
That.
we didn't move that, I don't think.
So
Didn't we move what?
the JEA contribution.
We moved on the JEA proposal. I said no, we did move on the general budget.
Okay.
We didn't move to exclude the JEA proposal.
Okay, so did anybody make,
I think we voted on that. I think Gwen moved and it was seconded and we
On the
voted that we
general-
weren't going to use JEA
on the
as a
general.
source.
she,
No, that-
you're right.
Okay.
So,
Gwen thinks she did.
what's, let me just, we're not quite ready yet, sir, for the public. So we'll have the time. So let me just pose it without there being a motion that we had the issue of real estate assets, that might be a possibility on a one-shot basis coming forward, that'd be something that would go in our report. Do we, as opposed to voting up or down the JE proposal, do we want to say something like that either is or is not, I'm just saying, is or is not, and if they can work it out later, they can bring it back. Or Bob is over here saying he wants to, I think you wanted to exclude it altogether. So would you like to make a
I was
motion?
just a little nervous.
All right, so would you like to make a motion?
Well, I don't think what the city does with the real estate has anything to do with this at this point. We have said that city contribution has to be $200 million a year, and if the city gets it other ways, even sells real estate, I don't want to get involved in it.
And would that mean you feel the same way about the JA proposal?
Yes.
Okay. So is there a motion, or you made the motion before, didn't you?
That's what I
Okay.
thought.
Okay, so there is a motion to eliminate from our recommendations the JEA proposal. Is there any further discussion? All in favor, say aye. There was a second. There was a second. And Kirsten said it now if we need one. All opposed, say no. Okay. All opposed, say no. Carl, you going to vote yes or no? You're not voting? Okay. All right. Let me just go. All in favor of eliminating the JE proposal as one of our recommendations, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? I'm going to vote no. So there are two against. And David's abstaining.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to add, JEA is in the middle of a process evaluating that proposal right now. I just respectfully wonder if it's premature for the task force to weigh yay or nay on a proposal that JEA is going through their own process of evaluating right now. And frankly, this is one of the suggestions that the JCCI study recommended for increased revenue, since we've been talking about that. So given that JEA is in a process of evaluating it, I wonder if this is premature for the task force to address this or not.
With that comment, would anyone like to move to reconsider our motion? Charlie moves it. The chair would second, but the chair can't second. Does anybody else? David seconds it. And then, oh gosh, is this from the JA?
I think it's from the Office of General Counsel.
Let me just say, as the chair, just for whatever it's worth, that the more flexible we can be, I think there ought to go in the report something said about real estate and something said about the JA proposal. We don't have to endorse it, but the more flexibility we give is important. So I would encourage you to vote to, what are we doing? We're voting to undo what we did. We're voting to reconsider our vote. So that would be my advice to you and the overall community, because we're not taking a position on whether it's good or bad. We're just asking it to stay before. Charlie?
The reason I'm in favor of the motion to reconsider, I think is where we are, is similar to what you just said. I think we should have a broader statement in there. This is our primary recommendation at this time, but to the extent there's other sources of revenue found, and we could say IEJA if we would like, then those should be considered when that becomes more fully vetted. I don't think we should take anything off the table.
Yeah.
We've made a recommendation of what our priority is, but there's other ways to do it, then they certainly should consider that.
Okay. Bill?
You can say, for example, JEA or real estate.
Okay.
That gives the flexibility.
Bob and then John.
I think our primary recommendation was the surtax. So if they follow through that, that'll generate a lot of revenue. But I would agree with Charlie, that doesn't mean we shouldn't turn our back on other sources of revenue.
Okay. John?
It gives us an option that's not a tax, and I think we ought to just at least keep that on the table to some degree.
So all in favor of reconsidering our prior action, say aye. Aye. All opposed? There are 3 against, and how many are in favor of reconsidering our proposal? Our action? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All opposed? 1, 2, 3. Okay. So that passes. Now the motion is back on, the motion to eliminate the JE proposal altogether. To reject it. Right.
As opposed to abstain.
Right. So,
Should not the motion, instead of being a negative, be?
what, that's the motion. So what, if someone wants to make an amendment that we, no, we got to act the right way, that we amend the motion to provide that other sources should be, in the judgment of the mayor and council, considered, such as the mayor's JEA proposal and the possibility of real estate assets in there. That's
Well, Bill, if we're going to articulate other sources of income, I know the bed tax is a challenge because you have to go to the state of Florida, but honestly, the city's in a lot of trouble. If we're going to really say other sources of funds, I'd like to broaden that even further. Bed tax is too low and it's too restricted, and other cities are using it. So,
all right, so
list that as well, knowing that it's got really, it's a real challenge to get there from here, but if we're going to explore, we should explore.
Sure, and so if you want to add in the EG or the IE, whatever that is, we'll put that in. Okay, so just let me have what that is in the draft.
Say including the expansion and the purposes of the bed tax. That's
Okay.
how I would say that.
All right, bed tax, okay. And I'm sure if I forget about that in the draft, you'll let me know. All right, so the motion, and I haven't heard anybody make, Gwen made the motion. Is there a second? Ready to vote? All in favor, say aye. Aye. On the amendment, all opposed? No. Two against on the amendment. Now, we have an amended motion. All in favor of the amended motion, which is to consider all these sources, which we will put an IE in there. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Two against, okay. All right, so I think, is there anything else to be done?
Just one clarification of intent. When
Yep.
we said $200 million, that's cash. That's not
That's cash.
real estate value.
That's right. That's cash. What we'd already said back in November was we weren't going to equate real estate. Right. So, okay. We've got a little bit more to do, or you may want to. I got one comment or one set of comments from David about the governance memo. So I'm assuming that all of y'all, and that 90% needs to change. We need to move the 30-year agreement to a different clause. So suppose y'all continue to look at it and get any comments, and I'm going to try to redraft it to pick up some of the what David's comments were. Let me just ask, did y'all compare the red lines? Because this is where y'all last acted, January 29th. Can I start with what we have now and then add to that David's comments?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll take this as quote adopted for purposes of review, and we'll go from here. Okay, good. Bob, did you have a question?
When this is all wrapped up and we've completed all these, how we've addressed governance and unfunded liability and pension reform and so on, this would be a composite report. And I would like to see, we're going to have to vote on it in front of us, composite report. And I suggest that a supplement to that composite report be something from David Drain, which summarizes it, and we have an executive summary that the public will be able to understand and see graphs and charts and understand what we've done.
That's my intention, and David and I talked briefly about that, but I think we now have to have in a graphic way what we're doing in support of that and the rationale.
The public will never understand our composite report. They might understand a visual summary and bullets.
Would you like to be on the drafting committee?
No, sir.
All right, David, did you understand that?
I understand that. Is that something, so I'm obviously happy to help with this in any way that the task force desires. This may be something that the actual report is, and I don't know if this is something that there's existing process on, should be written by someone, including, any sort of summary documents by someone on the task force with outside help?
I think that's going to end up me, but David, I'm going to ask David if he'll work on the part of the pension design part of it, because he probably understands that better, so that'll be part of it. And all that'll come together, then we'll get with Pew, and we'll get them to help us sort of articulate it and then justify it with the graphs and the visual stuff.
And just to make sure I understand the process going forward, and so the public listening, so the next step is to create the composite report that then subsequently gets voted on by the task force?
We'll be working on that, but I'm sensing that we still have a little we got two little pieces of work at our next meeting, and it may be that we have a draft that we can come around on next week that we can then take, because I don't think you're going to, I mean, you could do the modeling now for what we've decided today. So and I'll get with you and we can do this is what the unfunded liability, what the pay down would do, so that we can explain in a graph what the current is, what the savings are, all of it, like the proposals we've seen before have, so that it all gets in one place that we can go out and sell to the public.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can easily describe what's been
Sure.
decided on so far.
And I do have to say, Pew has been great, and they do have a press area. We're going to need that as to how we message this going forward. So, and y'all have been so generous, and we appreciate it. Right. So, in fact, I think Bob, did you have a question?
No, I was just going to reiterate what you said, that whatever the summary is and whatever the public disclosure is shouldn't be written by any technical person.
Right. Yeah, Bob and I had, when we were doing the incentives report, Bob redrafted part of it, which was a little bit, and we had to clean that up a little bit. So, okay, we need to do two things. Number one, the next meeting, I would like to suggest we can either do it with the room availability, we can do it next Wednesday from 1 to 5. We can do it next Thursday from 9 to 1 and Friday from 9 to 1. I don't think we're going to need the 5 hours. My preference would be Thursday from 9 to 1. But
What's the date of that?
that's the 6th. But Wednesday, actually, I think my preference would be Wednesday from 1 to 5. You won't be when? Any of those?
I'll be here
Thursday.
Can't be here on
All right, so I'm hearing two people can't be here on Wednesday.
I can't be here on Wednesday.
David can't be here on when?
I can't be here Wednesday, and I think Thursday morning would be very difficult.
Okay. We can have another room, Carol, Thursday afternoon. Thursday afternoon? Got a problem. How about Friday morning?
Friday's good.
I won't be here Friday.
No problem. No, can't, no, there's 3 or 4. All right. Okay, let's try this. Wednesday afternoon. How many people cannot be here Wednesday afternoon? 1, 2. Ooh, that's a lot. Okay. Thursday morning from 9 to 1. Thursday afternoon. Thursday afternoon. Yes or no?
Are we doing yes or no?
Thursday afternoon, can you be here?
Thursday afternoon, like what you.
I'm seeing everybody except.
Like 1 to 5.
1 to 5. Hopefully it won't take us that long. 1 to 5. John cannot. You cannot. David cannot.
What was wrong with
Friday
Friday?
is fine. Friday
I
from
won't be
9.
Friday.
Oh, there's several people that couldn't do Friday. Okay. This week, David can't be here. I thought we just canceled that one. All right. All right, we canceled that one. So, David, I hate for you not to be here. But that's the only person. So Thursday, what did we say? Thursday afternoon? Is that what we said? Thursday afternoon from 1 to 5, and I don't think it'll take all that time. Thursday, 1 to 5, and we'll have to find a room to do that. That's the 6th. And so, Carol, we'll put you hard to work. We might ask Cindy to issue a binding authoritative opinion that we can have this room. So we will work on that. Now, again, I want to thank y'all for your, I was astounded when I read David Bauerlein's article this morning that we had met 17 times. That included the subcommittee, but that is a lot of work, and y'all have been really gracious in your time. He said to me today that we're approaching as many hours as the city council spent on the budget last year. So, right. So we now need to open the meeting up for the public, and and it's now 4:25, I think. So we're going to have everybody that speaks, they'll have a maximum of 2 minutes. 2 minutes. And Bob, will you be our timer? Bob, and I want you to not be bashful. Say time when the time is up. All right, here's the microphone. Okay, please say your name and address for the record.
You want? Yeah, name is Thomas. Live at 5201 Atlantic Boulevard. You all have this copy of my letter, which is selling the JEA to Florida Power and Light. And I think you misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm selling all of the physical facilities that generate electricity to Florida Power and Light. The JEA stays intact, completely intact. It buys electricity from Florida Power and Light at 25% less than it costs them to produce it. Everybody gets the benefit, but it doesn't benefit to the people, which is what my first proposal was the last time. This time, the $378.5 million goes to the city. To the city, because the JEA is not charging the regular rates. The public is still going to pay the same, the business people will pay the same. So if you can say you don't want $375 million, it doesn't cost you a dime. I'm not selling the physical JEA building. Everything works just like it was. They're a reseller then, instead of being a producer. If you can buy something like the car people, they don't build them in Detroit. They went down into the country. Foreign companies. Honda comes over here and builds the cars. They can't afford to build them back over there. So what I'm doing is I'm outsourcing. That's outsourcing. The other thing that's involved is this is basically privatizing. None of you heard about privatizing? This is where municipalities are stuck and states are stuck where they can't meet all of their obligations. So they sell it to private investor groups. They sell highways. They sell buildings, and they get ad valorem for it, and they unload all of the obligations to go with it by owning it. Other than that, I say, if you don't want to do it, it doesn't bother me one bit.
Tom. Great. Thank you.
Pardon me. Oh, what?
Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right. State your name and address.
My name is Bill Gassett, Jacksonville, Florida. 4 quick points. First of all, when you start to sell this effort, the grand extraction, that is raising taxes, I would suggest you use the phraseology of tax per capita and don't take people down the weeds about it. It's, on a real estate tax or sales tax or something like that. It'd have a much more, I think, equal things. Point number 2, the 1.5% cap is absolutely slave wages. I want to vote against them, a private citizen and a private investor, and I think it's terrible to suggest to punish. This first chart here, the hard printed one I did together, indicates maybe what you've discussed is already out of date, unfunded. You will see, for example, starting at the beginning, whenever the $1.7 billion was established, you had that 7% accrual. So if you go down the road 2 years from now, you already owe and do nothing. You have a $2 billion obligation. And interestingly, I stopped at 2018 because it just gets too scary if nothing passes. Point number 3, if you look at this colored chart, it's a thing of the Dow Jones history. I've used that because that's the only thing I can find that would say what to expect on investments in the stock market. And what it shows, quite simply, it's awfully darn tough to get 7 or 8% return. I purposely went back to the year 1994, assuming the class of 1994, they're in their 20th year, that's where we start. These guys only average 7.5% roughly. The problem I've got with all this is that if you go back to 1990, it's 8%. The question is, nobody's answered here, is this thing get highly unfunded because we assume too low a rate of return to bring in the bucks? Now, I know there's some other issues, don't misunderstand me. So therefore, I would suggest using 5.4% chart that was designed as an estimate on how to plan your stuff. And I would say probably shoot more towards a 9 to 10% number in terms of a gross return. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Just to know, we are funding on the basis of 5.4, not 7.
I understand. I'm glad to hear it.
Say your name and address.
Colonel Oliver, 8527 Oak Leaf Road.
Now, I want to say that y'all have done a great job, but I'm gonna tell you, one of the hardest things gonna be taking place is that election season's coming up, and then you have an issue of not everybody's gonna be reading the newspaper trying to keep up with this whole pension thing. The educational piece is gonna be really the hard part, because when you start talking about taxes and all that, revenue sources, not everybody's gonna be very intrigued about these issues in which this city is delivered with. Now, not everybody's gonna go to the COJ website. The only time people gonna go on COJ website is when they found a complaint about something with the garbage or something like that. It's gonna be an enforcement of people knocking on doors, informing people of different issues that are going on. You know, the only people that are gonna be really knowing of this is gonna be the people that have established, the white collar community. Blue collar community is gonna have a hard enough time trying to keep the lights on, taking care of their family. Only established is gonna be understandable of this, but not the blue collar. We cannot leave them out of the equation. And they're not gonna be the group that's gonna be picking up being understandable of these situations. Within the language in which y'all are gonna craft, make it very simple and reasonable. And you've got to get every citizen on board with the educational piece. Because if they're not on board with the educational piece, it's not gonna pass. And the only option that we have is raising millage rates. The serve tax is not gonna pass if people are not educated.
Thank you very much.
Joseph A. Strasser, 3400 San Jose Boulevard. First of all, let me thank you for your service, like everybody else has. I think there's a few points that need to be made. The sheriff spent some time talking about for example, he mentioned the 4-year college degree. And I want to emphasize that that 4-year degree was implemented, as he said, by Nat Glover when he was sheriff. And Nat Glover also did some reorganization, bringing the assistant chiefs in. But the big thing is that Nat Glover exhibits the kind of philanthropic giving that I have done myself. He gave 4 years of his city police fire pension to charity, 4 of his 8 years. And I think this is what we need to do. We need more philanthropic giving, and it's something that I know that develops. We got to give back, and that's what it does. The other thing we need is we need a change in the management. It's very important, the management of the Police and Fire Pension Fund. It's obvious that we got into a position that, for example, the Florida retirement system is not in, and I'm a member of the Florida retirement system, as I indicated to you earlier in my first presentation. It's poor management, poor contributions from the city, and a lot of other things. But the important thing is that the solution that you came up with it's a starting point. But I don't think that people are going to buy more money, more spending, unless we get a reform in the Police and Fire Pension Fund management. If we don't get that, we have accomplished absolutely nothing. And we'll be back here again in 10 years, 15 years, or whenever. So thank you. Is my time up?
Thank you, Mr. Strasser. Okay, any other members of the public? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Joe Andrews, 7198 Cypress Cove Road, Jacksonville. Today, you talked about franchise taxes, ad valorem taxes, sales taxes, JEA funding, fire and rescue surtax, general funding. And I think the lady in the red jacket said she would like to broaden that set of categories into whatever else you can think of.
No, bed tax.
Okay. What I want to emphasize is the fact that not counting what the conduit is, there's only one source of funds, and that is the productive citizen of Jacksonville. There comes a point when you have to stop extracting resources from the taxpayer, because the more you take away from him, the less productive he is. The economy as a whole is what I'm talking about. So you just can't keep taking away. That's about all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, any other? Okay, this